Hi, Misha here, and a few months ago I asked the Patreons if they would prefer, if they want me to do a big deep dive video on either the FN FAL / L1A1 or the AR-10, AR-15 / M4, all that stuff. The overwhelming vote was for doing an FAL deep dive, so that's what we're going to do. And if you'd like to participate, you can always check out the Patreon. Haven't done a lot of polls and stuff, but going into 2024, I might start doing more of those if folks want. And if not, you can participate in the live streams. I actually collated some questions that I'll be answering in this video from a couple of live streams we've done. And if you can't do that, liking, sharing, subscribing helps a lot, because doing deep dive videos like this takes a good bit of time. Speaking of taking time, I did put off doing it because a couple of friends, when they found out I would be doing an FAL deep dive, offered a couple of guns that I don't have, but schedules didn't line up and we're already at the end of this year, 2023. I wanted to do what I could with my guns. The good news is, when I do get those loaner guns from friends, they can just be their own videos. One was a South African R1 and another was actually an Indian 1A1, so both should make for very interesting videos in their own right, but it will probably be next year before I get a chance to meet up and get those. Oh well, c'est la vie. And my FAL collection is not complete. There are missing bits and bobs because, much like with, say, AKs, there are so many variants. In fact, it's said that 90 nations or more use the FAL in some capacity, hence its nickname of the right arm of the free world. But I've tried to pick up the guns that I find most interesting and most correct over the years, and that's kind of my deal. A lot of FALs, I really like the build, but it's just not up to my snuff. Obviously, there were a lot of imports over the years and a lot of good kit builds, and some guns you can get as an import. Some guns you can only do as a kit build, truly. And we're going to cover this, that, and whatever else I feel like in this here video. And this will probably be something I release to let you chew on over the holiday, because I'll probably be taking a break in January, so leave you with a good long video or two. Why not? So with that, why don't we just dive in? And if we're going to talk about the FN FAL, we really have to begin with its father, which is actually a more closely related design than you might think. Of course, the FN model 1949, or if it's a select fire, the AFN 49. It went by many names. As I'm sure you know, the FN FAL story actually begins with what is frankly an honorary FAL, the FN 49, or SAFN, or in some cases, if you're Belgium, the AFN 49. This was really the first production model. Even though it does not look like an FAL, the mechanics were worked out with it. Going back in time, Fabrique Nationale Herstel's first ideas for a self-loading rifle really were in 1914, before World War I kicked off, but these were shelved and really never revisited. Fast forwarding 20 years, we come to Dudenève-Sèvres, John Browning's understudy essentially, who really became interested in a self-loading gas-operated gun in the early 1930s. In between 1932 and 36, he worked on several systems, and then in 36 he had his first patent. In 37, 38, they were kind of working out the bugs, trials, and really by 1939 he was ready to go into production. But in September, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and so the powers that be at FN decided to refocus resources to producing what guns were already ready to go, not new projects. Probably not a bad idea, because it wouldn't be long before May of 1940 when it was Belgium's turn to be invaded yet again. They had blown through, the Germans had blown through Belgium in World War I, and this is actually one of many reasons Cy was very against the Germans, and he did everything he could to bury his initial prototypes and designs and drawings so the Germans wouldn't find them. That might sound a little hyperbole, but remember, in 1940, the Germans did not have an infantry self-loading rifle. The Russians did. The Americans did. Even the French almost did, but the Germans did not. So why am I talking about this? Well, even with this early concept, we see the system that would be carried over all the way to the FAL. A tilting tipping bolt that would lock in the rear, a short stroke gas piston with a long gas rod, and in this instance a 5-round magazine. But like I said, it wouldn't go into production. Rather, Cy would go on the run. He would first cross over into France, and of course France would fall, and then he would get to Portugal, and from there in 1941 in the summer he would make his way over to England, and he would offer his services to the Allies there. And this actually connects to the John Inglis story in the Canadian High Power, which I've talked about several times. But today we're focusing on rifles, and that gets us to 1943, when the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield was working with Scythe to develop what was known at the time as the SLEM, or Experimental Model 1. It was an 8mm self-loading rifle for the British, or just Commonwealth in general. Interestingly, chambered in 8mm, not 303. Scythe did not go with 303 because it was a rimmed round. It didn't work well. And 8mm, well, they were already making the cartridge in England, so it was a good fit. Rimless round. There we go. So 50 test guns were ordered. They were made in 1944. And they were sent for kind of initial testing, and they were promising, and so they would order 2,000. Again, the SLEM 1 or Experimental Model 1, wherever. However, these 2,000 would never be built. The reason why is multifaceted, but it should be noted that these early prototypes were the earliest examples of Scythe's design, again, that would eventually lead to the FAL. For one, well, they had some initial issues with the gas system in trials, in testing. Honestly, that wasn't a deal breaker, but the war was wrapping up. They knew that. This is post D-Day. It's just a matter of time. And probably most importantly, Cy was ready to return home in September of 1944 because Belgium had been liberated. So he did just that, and it wasn't long at all before he was hard at work further developing his self-loading rifle, which at this time is just semi-automatic. So we go through the war, bum bum bum. By 1946, he has further developed it. This is when the FN kind of system appears. It wouldn't be long before a select fire version requested by the Belgian government, the AFN, also appears. Essentially the same gun, but with a selector switch added. Still with a fixed 10-round mag, still full caliber. If this seems ridiculous, it was, but it's what they wanted, and it's also why we don't have Belgian FN-49s in America today, because technically they were select fire machine guns. Thank you. Relatively late in development, Scythe would develop an adjustable gas system. Now on the FN-49, it's a dial under the handguard. So you need to pull off the handguard to get to it, but honestly that's pretty easy to do. Just move your barrel band. This is a 2-piece handguard, so it's relatively easy to access with just a screwdriver or other similar tool. This was good because it lets you fire a wide range of ammunition. You weren't just stuck to one loading. For example, the M1 Grand very much just needs and wants and really needs to have M2 ball. Well, you weren't stuck with that with the FN gun, which by this point was more or less verging on 30-06, 7.62 by 63 Springfield as it was known in Europe. That was the de facto European cartridge post World War II because of all the Garands and just general American influence. An interim cartridge for sure, but yeah. But it had another advantage. Because the gas system was so flexible, short stroke piston, all that, they could chamber it for just about anything a customer wanted. And post-war, FN needed business. They needed work. And so, within reason, they were the Burger King of gun makers. They would make the Whopper your way. So you just tell them what you wanted, they'd offer some features. By 1947, they had working prototypes to show off, and by 1948, they hung out their shingle. They were ready to take orders. So, now we can finally talk about this gun here specifically. In March of that year, the very, very first contract would be placed by Venezuela. It would be delivered in 1949, 2 batches of 2,000 between May and July of that year, plus another 12 training cutaway guns. And they must have liked them because they placed a second order for another 4,000 total in 1950. I don't have a Venezuelan FN-49. Fun fact though, it was my first one. I bought one ages ago, going on 20 years back. I found it at a local pawn shop. It's hanging on the wall. But I sold it. But don't worry, I sold it for a good reason. It was actually one of the guns I sold to start my business. It was at Bear Arms in 2009. So, as much as I do miss it, I didn't really have a Venezuelan gun collection, if that makes sense. And I needed capital, and that was the way to raise money. So, I've had one. The Venezuelan guns were unique in that they had a ribbed butt plate. It was just like steel ribbed. And they had a muzzle brake. To the best of my knowledge, they're the only ones, aside from the sniper variants, that came with a muzzle brake / flash hider. But all FN-49s, at least that I've seen, did have threaded barrels. Most just had a muzzle nut like this one. This one here, though, is my Egyptian contract gun. And it's in 8mm, 7.92 by 57. The Venezuelan guns were in 7 by 57. These are 2 of the 4 main chamberings that FN offered. The other ones, as I already mentioned, were in 30-06, 7.62 by 63, which was honestly about 90,000, or well, I guess if you count about 100,000, counting the Luxembourgian guns of the order. But again, we can't get many because they were select fire. And the other chambering was 7.65 by 53, often known as Argentine, but it actually started off as an FN caliber for the old 1889 Mauser. We'll touch on that in a minute. But yeah, Egypt would be the first country in the Middle East to grab these. The second contract overall around May of 1948. And that's a good place to talk about what FN was doing with these, what the market was. Because you would think post Second World War, there would be just a ton of surplus guns. Yes, German guns, but also the U.S. was giving guns away. They produced millions and giving away as aid. The Soviet Union was producing guns and giving them away. But FN saw a little niche, a little wedge to slide into. Third world nations. At this time, third world was almost a badge of honor that nations happily claimed, Yugoslavia among them. These are unaligned nations, because if you took aid from the USA or USSR, there were always strings attached. And like I said, with surplus German guns, excellent Mausers. Good pistols too, but they really did not have an adequate self-loading rifle. Little niche they could slide into. So FN targeted the third world nations or unaligned nations. That's why we see a lot of purchasers in South America and Egypt in the Middle East, and that's really where they go to. Belgium, of all things, was a more latecomer. Yeah, going back to Egypt here, they ordered some prototypes, around 100 in 1948. They got these in early summer of 1949. They tested them. They liked them. They ordered more. Ultimately, Egypt would get a pretty substantial order of about 37,600. And they would also get spare parts, including spare receivers. So this is kind kind of where it gets interesting. The ones that had the crown on them, those were full guns delivered during the reign of King Farouk. But there would also just be kind of surplus receivers sent over, spare parts, and they would have the eagle on top, so that Egypt could refurbish and rebuild their guns. They did never make any in Egypt, but they certainly would rebuild them over time. And these were delivered 1950. Belgium would actually order their first test guns in 1949. They would approve it, making a large order in 1950, around August, so late summer, so not just right before the Korean War. And so the Belgian select fire guns, of which they would get nearly 88,000, would start to see combat in the Korean War in 1951. It's also worth pointing out that the Belgian Congo ordered a few thousand as well. But we can't have those. Even though it's cool they're in 30-06, they're select fire. The only 30-06s we can legally own in America, unless you get a registered machine gun, are the ones from Luxembourg, which they had about 10,000. I've owned 2, maybe 3 Luxembourgian FN-49s in my life. They are very nice, but eventually the money, you know how it goes. 3,000-4,000 each. Thought they were cool, didn't think they were that cool. Figured, you know what, the Egyptian gun fits my collection. These saw service in the Suez conflict in 1956, and they're interesting enough, frankly. Can't keep everything in this old world. I wish I could, but such is life. There would be other contracts. A total of 8 to 9 nations would place major contracts for these, although over 20 nations would at least order test batches or prototype guns. And there would be several calibers made for testing, including some 6.5 Swedes, but yeah, the 4 calibers we already outlined are the ones that were put into full production. And you had other nations like Brazil, Colombia, you can look them up, that placed orders. Main production, though, was ordered over by 1956. Why is that? Well, getting kind of back to the whole point of this video, the FN FAL, yes, Sav wanted to get his design in the works, but if this seems a little outdated by the 1950s, you're not wrong. But it was the developed gun, it used the same principles, as we'll see later on, and it was a way to get cash flow to FN Herstal, and it did just that. So 56, it was pretty much over, being replaced by the FAL, no surprise. But there would be one final order placed at the tail end of 1960 and delivered at the beginning of 1961. This would be a contract for Indonesia. Kind of odd, but okay. And these were mostly built from leftover spare parts. That's not to say they were poor quality, still Belgian assembled, but yeah, they were just kind of using up. And the few parts and guns that remained after that were actually commercially sold here in the US of A. But let's talk about features before we move on. Overall length, this is about 43.5 inches. Longer if you have the variant from Venezuela with the muzzle brake. And it weighs roughly 9.5 pounds unloaded. Again, it can change a little bit depending on the thing. The barrel is just over 23 inches. And from the factory, most variants had the kind of black paint finish. In Britain, the Sunkerite, this is more of a black enamel used. Fair. And the stocks are made of oiled walnut. Again, we're talking from the factory. Refurbishments change everything. The stock had a semi-pistol grip. This one has a butt trap. Others, like the Venezuelan, don't. The mag is fixed. It is double stack, double feed, 10 round. We have a protected, adjustable, traditional rifle rear sight, a reciprocating cocking handle, and then a protected front sight. We have a bayonet lug quite far back on the barrel, and like I said, a threaded barrel, and bottom mounted sling swivels, and a leather sling was standard. The action, the system, was very much that Sive had been working on since the early 1930s. There we go. Very stiff spring when you're on a weird angle. A tilting, tipping bolt. short stroke piston that comes out here hitting the carrier. Again, you would top it off by stripper clips, by chargers. Usually 5 rounders were used. This, as you see, have a last round hold open. There are tons of variation. Little dust cover here. It's kind of cool. It's not spring loaded, it's just friction fit. And one feature that I always thought was neat when I first bought my Venezuelan, there's a little pin that hangs off the bottom of the trigger guard. It's not a loaded chamber indicator, it's a cocked indicator. And we have a fold down safety. And what's kind of neat, you might think that's a little awkward, but it's actually very good at letting you know your safety's on because it basically blocks your trigger. It's very positive and protected. If you have a select fire version, there's a separate switch for that. FN would build roughly 175,000 of these. Not insignificant. And again, roughly 90,000 were of the select fire variant, with the remaining balance being the semi-automatic. With primary production lasting from late 1948 through 1956, with a small run between 60 and 61. After that, that was it. But not a bad run. The fact that this was successful at all for a post-World War II self-loading rifle was pretty impressive. And it proved to be a very good combat gun, namely in the Korean War, but also in the Suez Crisis, and quickly made a name for itself. But it was always a stepping stone towards something much bigger, much more important, and frankly, one of the top, let's say, 3 to 4 influential guns of the early Cold War period. So we're going to return to the couch, because another thing I want to do in this video, and we'll pop back over here from time to time, is to talk about owning these in the USA. You know, your choices, your options. And so we begin with the FN-49, specifically my Egyptian. The very first Egyptian guns actually came in the 1950s, late 50s, around 58, 59, and these came in by Interarms via Israel, and they were battlefield capture guns from Egypt from 1956, the Suez. So there were batches that came in then, and then, as I mentioned, FN sold some essentially new production guns built from leftover parts in the US in the early 60s too. And then between around 65 and 67, there were several import batches, Venezuelan guns, some Luxembourg guns, but no Belgian Army or Belgian Congo guns, because those were the AFNs. Now, some of the Luxembourgian guns were accidentally AFNs too, but they were cleared because the powers that be at the time treated things a bit differently, and they were allowed. Which is actually something we'll see with FALs. I don't know why, but FN guns tend to get a pass when other guns don't. But they were converted to semi-auto only because really in full auto they were very impractical. But then in the Gun Control Act of 1968 really actually put the kibosh on importing these, or it just made them very difficult. So we don't see FN 49s coming in throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. But then in the mid-80s, import restrictions, regs, qualifications change, and we see Egyptian guns start to come back in 1985 through the 80s and 90s, mostly via Century Arms for what I've seen. And we see a lot of Egyptian guns just because Egypt was rather closely aligned with the West at this time, and because it was a relatively large contract. Like I said, it was over 37,000 that they had, plus spare receivers and parts. And that's why I kind of mentioned about the Crown versus the Eagle. Also, some of the guns that Century brought over either didn't have stocks, the stocks were in really poor condition, so you'll see some replacement stocks. You can usually tell those by the butt plate. And other small importers would bring them in too, and you'll see a few other small batches, but this would run through the 80s and early 90s. But keep in mind, of the 176,000 FN-49s built, 90,000 were machine guns and couldn't come in. So you only had about 85, 86,000 in the world, and we've already been importing them for decades. So they do tend to kind of taper off into the 90s, early 2000s. I still remember seeing some in Century at that time, but they were getting harder and harder to find as we get into the 21st century. So now we can move from the SAFN, the FN-49, to the FAL, finally, proper. And I suppose the best example I have of a relatively early metric pattern is my Israeli Romat, their name for the light barrel. And even this isn't a true metric, because this was based on a very early version. Most nations would go to a later version, kind of retroactively known as the 50.00 fixed stock full-length barrel. But let's back up. Work began on the next generation in 1946, so pretty immediately after World War II. And Cy was assisted by Ernest Verrier and several others, but he was kind of the next guy in line I felt like mentioning. And prototypes would exist as early as 1947, and these were chambered for 7.92 by 33 8mm Kerrs, so the MP44 round. A lot of nations were experimenting with this round at this time, a true intermediate cartridge, although an early version of. In 1948, the British tried it out and suggested, hey, we've got this new 280 cartridge, so relatively small diameter, in the 6mm-esque range, about 6.5. But what about that? It's kind of a more substantial version, slimmer than 8mm Kerrs, but a little more. Yeah. So that worked out well. In 1950, the U.S. tried out a version and suggested, actually, let's do 30 light rifle, which was a prototype of what we would know as 308, which would become 7.62 NATO, essentially a modernized and slightly shortened and lightened 30-06. Again, a lot of FN-49s being chambered for that. This would lead to an agreement in 1951. Essentially, FN would rework their gun from 8mm Kerrs to 280 to 30 light rifle, which honestly kind of explains why the FAL has a bit of a stretched out look in the receiver and a bit of an elongated look. The earlier versions would be just, inch here, inch there, shorter, but yeah. And also, FN was going to offer royalty-free license production to any allied nation that helped liberate Belgium. This would, of course, include the USA, Britain, and several others. What a sweet deal. But of course, that gets complicated. We will get into it. But so that was kind of the earlier chamberings. And after the FN-49 was in production, they got serious about this. By 1951, they started showing off pre-production models. The light automatic rifle, the FAL, or LAR in translation, would start appearing in catalogs, but it wasn't in production yet. Actual production would officially begin at the end of 1953. Now, at this time, several nations would try it out. Famously, the U.S. would have the T-48, made by HRA. Also, High Standard made some. These would be for trials, going up against the T-47 and the T-44. I wish I had a T-48 to show you. That would be amazing, but I don't. Sorry. Canada and England would also try out versions, and this would actually lead to the Allied Rifle Commission, or Allied Rifle Steering Commission, and let's put a pin in that for now, because we're going to come back to it. They would suggest a common rifle, a common cartridge, and once they kind of settled on the good old FN FAL, they suggested some improvements that nations could adopt or not, because just like with the FN-49, Belgium was happy to be Burger King and kind of design your contract FAL any way you wanted it. The only difference is they're pretty much all going to be in 7.62 NATO 308, 7.62 by 51. We don't really see the caliber being an option, but the configuration, sights, furniture, all that definitely could be. So you have some nations getting interested in 1953, 54. There's some adoptions. Israel was one of the first nations, but not the first, to select the FAL in 1955. And because this was relatively early on, and because they received guns relatively early, they are different from later metric patterns. So what are our overall dimensions? What is our gun here that Israel went for? Surprisingly, it's pretty similar to the FN-49, roughly 9 to 10 pounds, depending on exactly which configuration unloaded. Overall length of 43 inches, again, that varies. And a slightly shorter barrel, again, shorter cartridge, so it makes sense, at about 21 inches. Fun fact, the sight radius is nearly 22 inches. We have a protected front sight that's adjustable, and then a sliding rear sight that's adjustable. And if these look taller than what you're used to seeing, that's because the earlier versions had tall sights. This has an Israeli replacement gas block on it, but the original ones had this kind of open ear style like the FN-49. This is the so-called Type C buttstock with the metal ferrule. There would be Type A's very early on, Type B's more produced, Type C's would have this reinforcement. This one does not have a trapdoor, but it does have a metal butt plate. Again, lots of variations here. This is actually a shorter stock than Mini. We have a polymer pistol grip. Some would have wood early on. Storage compartment inside. Non-reciprocating charging handle. One unique feature the Israelis went with was a forward assist. You can press this in and lock the bolt and carrier and the charging handle together, otherwise not. We have easy to access bolt hold open and release, mag release, trigger. Now the Israeli FAL, the ROMAT, the standard version, was limited to safe and semi. Carry handle. These are the later Israeli two-piece type handguards with the metal in front, wood in back, and an open gas tube. We'll look closer at that in a minute. Earlier guns, of course, had a full wood handguard. Very cool. And the barrel is quite interesting, and it's not just the Israeli guns. They all had just a bare muzzle and a lug here. One thing I do want to point out before we get into that, though, the gas system is different on an Israeli pattern as a general rule from later metrics. Mostly the length of the gas plug and the gas piston are different from later ones. We do have a gas regulator multi-position, whereas on the FN-49 it's hidden by the handguard. It's roughly in the same place, a little more forward, but it's more accessible here, so you can easily rotate it. Sometimes it will get stuck. It's hard to do it by hand, but a simple tool, or frankly a bottle opener, can easily get there. But it gives it that great degree of flexibility to fire all kinds of 7.62 NATO loadings. We have a machined receiver. These were originally Type 1s. And they did all they could, including scalloping the trigger guard to save on weight. The top cover is stamped steel. Pretty much everything else is originally machined. Very old world construction. So let's look at that muzzle in detail and kind of look at why they did it that way. Flipping it over, fewer controls on this side. More of this interesting asymmetrical flap. Exposed ejection port, no port cover, of course. Folding carry handle. This is an Israeli style, but early FNs were several variations. Notice the Israelis used a type of sling inspired by the British. Here's that exposed gas tube. And it has these donuts to kind of act as spacers. On this version, they're 360 degrees. Some guns only have two, some have one. Just kind of depends. And this gas regulator here, we'll get back to in a minute. But these barrels, like I said, 21 inches, have this rather flush lug and then a bare muzzle crown. Now, you know, a lug is for a bayonet, you know that. But you might kind of wonder, what about flash hiders? This is 1955. Yes, flash hiders were a known thing, especially with a effectively 30 caliber bullet coming out of a less than 2-foot barrel. Well, this did have a flash hider. It was integrated into the bayonet. Here's our standard scabbard, pretty, well, standard. Relatively thin and short bayonet, and it acted, at least in theory, as a 3-prong flash hider. Because that lug is so flush with the barrel, the bayonet fits very snug up against it, letting the crown stick out just a bit. And again, in theory, that's supposed to flash hide. It also had another fun feature, wherein that there was a spring, if I can show you here. Maybe. Where it would move about half an inch, quarter inch. And that was done with hopes of offsetting recoil, so that the point of impact would not shift bayonet on, bayonet off, and recoil. How effective it was, but it's an interesting notion. The whole bayonet on this really intrigues me. That's why, even though I'm not a bayonet collector, I had to get one for the Israeli. And so they would deploy them. But of course, the whole idea of a lug is interchangeable devices. So, replacing the bayonet on the muzzle would be this grenade launcher assembly. Using the same lug, there's a easy to use plunger device on the bottom to take it on and off. You would rotate your gas regulator to the off position, different from the regulator back here. I guess this is the gas valve to be exact. Again, this is a very flexible gas system. This is also how you disassemble if you need your piston out. And then you would simply flip up your handy dandy included sights. And the Israelis issued the AT-52 rifle grenade. And they did actually have a few of these already in the field because they were in desperate need of weapons. 1956, the Suez Crisis. Not many, but a few. And that means actually the Egyptians were fielding the Grandpa up here, the FN-49 and 8mm against the new Israeli Romat and 7.62 NATO. And here's some more soft goods. This is a 2-cell Israeli pouch with authentic wear and tear from the field. I have several of these pouches. They used them for Uzi mags and FAL mags and whatever else. And here's a pouch for a grenade launcher. I don't think this one's Israeli. Oops. Because it's leather. Oh well. It's done. It's not on being on camera. But it does fit the grenade launcher. The grenade launcher is definitely Israeli though. Just thought I'd show those briefly. I love pouches. You know that. And of course that does lead me to the point that these use so-called metric pattern 20-round mags. You know YouTube's rules about pulling mags in and out. So here's another one. I'll just take it out of the pouch. This is the metric. Note the flat butt plate. The asymmetric on the back here, this rib, that's for the bolt hold open, metal follower, and just a small little dimple in the front to latch in. All metal mag, relatively lightweight, stamped steel, relatively easy to construct. As far as I know, these are actually Israeli marked mags too. So back to a bare muzzle. As we already mentioned, the forearm here is the later two-piece style. Originally they were the single-piece wood, which was relatively breakable. Same goes for the early Type A, Type B stocks going to the Type C. Makes sense. The Israeli guns tended to have a little bit shorter length of pull. The gas block, being Israeli, is kind of cool. This is not only a more robust system than the open ear, it's actually cast. Here's the bolt held open. We can look at the Israeli carry handle. It's basically polymer on the rod. It does not rotate. So this gun has definitely been upgraded in service, and of course, being a semi-auto built here, that too. Flipping it back over, you can see the non-reciprocating handle. These do have a detent in the front so they don't flop about. And again, you can press the Israeli in and use it as a forward assist. Of course, our bolt release is here. Quite easy to use. Our recoil spring goes in the buttstock, tipping bolt system. The Israeli selector is quite unique for what it is. And originally these would have the vertical takedown, but this was found to be less than ideal for actually several reasons. So most would end up getting the horizontal style later on. And so yeah, guns like these that actually saw service were upgraded. In fact, this is the later style cocking handle, larger, beefier, because Israel used these. They were an early adopter, not only of the FAL, but of the 308, the 7.62 NATO cartridge. Think about it, 1955, not many nations were fielding these. Serving in 56, by 1967, with the 6 Days War, this was their primary infantry rifle. And it would still be very much in frontline service by 1973, by the Yom Kippur War. But by that time, newer ideas and more mechanized, shorter guns were kind of coming in vogue. So by 1980, these were effectively out of really front line, even a lot of second line service, and being surplused out. But they served for a good 25 years and were one of the few early metrics to really see service. IMI would make most parts for the Romat, barrels, gas blocks, furniture, but never receivers. However, IMI would never make receivers. Many, of course, would come with their guns they ordered from FN, but they would get spare receivers, some complete, some more or less incomplete forgings, so not dissimilar to how Egypt had done with the FN-49. Really neat. I encourage you to study the Israeli FAL, the Romat, and its big brother, which, yes, we will get to. Because, yeah, these saw combat more than a lot of other FALs in service. And effectively, this is a 50.00, although in 1955, this nomenclature really wasn't being used yet. And I did say this was a metric, or at least an Israeli variant metric. Let's go back to that Allied Rifle Commission. So, what if you want an Israeli light barrel, a Romat, and semi-automatic in the USA? Your first option came in 1987, running through about 89 when the, well, executive order came down. If you're on this channel, you know what I'm talking about. You had two companies importing Israeli guns, Onyx and Arms Corps. And these were authentic guns. These were semi-automatics, but they weren't brand new, fully built guns, and they didn't come from IMI. A company in Israel known as Stuckner Brothers Limited, SBL, obtained parts and equipment and essentially rebuilt existing guns. They had some of the incomplete FN receivers and they finished them out, which is kind of interesting because you'll see effectively quasi type 1 and sometimes type 3 looking receivers. Basically, SBL did different types of lightning cuts. Like this one's mostly a type 1, but you notice the magwell is flat and up here isn't fully cut out as compared to some later guns, and some have more cuts, some have left. This one's pretty much a straight type 1, just, you know, different magwell, but you'll see different ones in the SBLs. So these receivers came out of Israel. They were original FN forgings, but the machine work was done by SBL, which let them be a semi-automatic only. The only really downside is the way they did the riveting for the semi-automatic ejector block. Some consider a little ugly, but it works. And they built these using surplus Israeli kits. So I would say the numbers don't match, but they never really matched anyway after decades of service, so that doesn't really matter. And they would do heavy barrels too, but most SBLs I've seen were the light barrel, which is cool because light barrels are far less common in the US today when it comes to IDF guns. What's funny is these were the economic choice. These were sold as a cheaper way to get into an FN FAL in the late 80s. J-Ro's father actually purchased his from a catalog back when they were new. I got mine from a friend who runs Honey Creek Industries, and I did intentionally want one with the lugged bare barrel. You could also find SBL guns with the combo device on them. That's what J-Ro's father has. And you can find them that have both. But yeah, they were pre-89 guns, so no US parts. Technically all Israeli, even if the receiver was, made differently. I do like it that they're correct as semi-automatic guns, because so many of the Israeli IDF guns had the semi-automatic selector. Of course, they did not have the auto-sear cutout, which in reality is an out-of-battery safety, but the IRS/ATF has to pick something to make these a machine gun, so there it is. Post 1989, if you wanted one of these, you basically had to get a parts kit and build it up. Unfortunately, light barrel kits are just not as common even now. But fortunately, a couple of years ago, DS Arms did release a light barrel FAL built on their receiver with a US barrel. And it's not half bad, especially if you want one as a shooter. So if you can't find a kit and do a build yourself, or find one that's already built, the DS guns aren't horrible. We'll talk more about DSA throughout the video, I'm sure. There's goods and bads to say about them. So that's basically your options to own one in the US. And hey, look, it's another cat. That's why we do these things on the couch. Say hi, Earl. I'm sure that was cat for hi. Honestly, be impressed I've held off this long talking about it. The SLR, self-loading rifle, designated in England as the L1A1. This is the inch pattern, and Britain was there from the beginning. As like I said, Sive would spend time in England with the SLAM, the slim prototypes, and then the British were really at the forefront of wanting a universal rifle and cartridge for all of NATO to share after World War II. And as I mentioned earlier, they suggested the 280, basically a 7mm cartridge. Yes, earlier I know I said 6mm or something, but math's hard. And this was trialed out in 1950, but eventually it would give way to the US 30 caliber light rifle, the T65 cartridge. And there was a bunch of back and forth. 1951, though, even though the British had been trying out the FN FAL, they ended up going with the EM2 bullpup in the 280 chambering. But before it could actually go into service as such, by the end of 51, beginning of 52, Winston Churchill's party would take back over and cancel the whole thing, and we would get back to the FAL. And Churchill was really instrumental in, okay, the US really wants this 30 caliber light rifle. There's pros and cons to the 280 versus the 30 cal. Most of us today would think the 280 is better, but back then, the idea of standardization, the US is the big kid on the block, and there were some ballistic advantages to 30 light rifle, soon to be 7.62x51 NATO. So by 1953, we're moving forward there. Ironically, the US does not adopt the FAL, but Britain will. In fact, by the end of 53, they say, okay, we're going to go with the new cartridge and the new rifle. And so at the beginning of 54, they order 5,000 X8 test guns. Most would have iron sights, but around 1,000 would actually have a non-magnified optical sight, which, while it was never adopted and actually was one of the few things carried over from the EM2 bullpup, would actually influence the L1A1 in maybe a little bit of an unexpected way. But the British would actually test this gun for a number of years, therefore allowing Canada to be the first nation to officially adopt as its standard service gun, becoming the C1. And from that point, a lot of FN literature referred to at least their variant is the Canada model. And these were built with some suggestions from the Allied Rifle Steering Commission, and improvements from the metric, and also things that the British wanted. Now this version here has been updated with 1970s style polymer, so-called Marinil furniture. Originally it would have wood. Heck, originally even the carry handle was wood. But it still has the tall sights. Note the open ear front. But they never much liked the lugged bare muzzle system. One of the suggestions that both Canada and Britain would go with was this type of muzzle device with a small lug underneath, and it actually has a key for timing here that slots into the barrel. It does screw on. This is the later style hider with 3 slots. Earlier ones were 5. Has the same gas regulator, same adjustments here. A little bit larger carry handle, and it has a folding rear sight. Now let's talk about top covers. I truly and really wish I had a Canadian C1 or C1A1, the later variant, to show you. I don't. I had a build once, but had to sell it, and frankly it had a lot of Aussie parts because Canadian parts are very hard to get. Anyway, the Canadian gun, as with the British Trials X8s, had the top cover cut back to here and an open top to take 5-round chargers. That's why there's actually small squares at the rear here, little cutouts for spacing, and they would be left because Britain, after doing a lot of hot and dry sandy weather testing, decided that the top cover charging system, while maybe it was faster to top off than switching out at your entire mag, it wasn't worth it, so they dropped it. Now they did add sand cuts to the bolt carrier. That's kind of neat. But Canada would keep the top cover feed system, at least for their infantry rifle. The Canadian version, instead of having the popsicle rear sight, actually has a disc style. And the reason it folds is because even though they never went with the unmagnified optical sight, they would eventually go to the suit, which would mount on a top cover, a 4-power scope that was not always on these guns, but often on these guns. Another interesting feature that appeared on these early guns was a folding trigger guard. This guard hinges here. This actually has a small screw. You can fold it into the pistol grip, which is a totally different style of grip from the quote-unquote metric. Note the receiver cuts and the controls. Now the buttstocks on these polymer versions actually set their length of pull based on the butt plate. These are modular butt plates, small, medium, and long, and actually extra long, so you could just screw on your butt plate. The early wood stocks, though, actually were cut to different lengths and were marked, and they had a steel butt plate with a trap in them. I just thought I would mention that real quick. So they did set the length of pull to try to suit the individual soldiers as best they could. Leaving the FN49 on the table 1 minute longer just to show you that technically the L1A1 is longer because of this muzzle device. Still a 21-inch barrel. And the reason it's of course called the SLR, this was not intended to have select fire. It was just safe and repetition, safe semi-auto only. Now the trials guns they worked with did have the full select fire capability, but Britain decided not to go with it. And frankly, I can't blame them. For one thing, they were switching from the bolt action infield. And for another, with the 30 light rifle cartridge, 7.62 NATO, full auto is not controllable unless with a lot of training with your soldiers. Yeah, I get it. It makes sense. So a few other things. We have this folding charging handle. Makes sense so it doesn't poke your back. The mag catch, remember we're on YouTube, you can't take a mag out, but it does come over to the left side, which ergonomically makes sense. Your finger falls there. Now your bolt release here is interesting. This is a manual release. These do not have last round hold opens built in. You could push it up, hold it open manually, but they didn't want a last round hold open. A good reason for that was, again, that sandy, dusty environment they tried these out in. In fact, not only did they do trials in the field because of the colonies, they actually sent some of the early SLRs over to Egypt in 1956 to kind of have field combat trials there. And basically they're just trying to keep the action as closed up as possible, and that was part of it. Notice it has the still vertical takedown. The British really weren't launching rifle grenades out of these like, say, the Israelis, so that's part of the reason. Part of it is the design just kind of got fixed in place. Alright, now I think it's time to firmly move past the FN-49, so we'll put the Israeli metric, the Romat, with the L1A1 SLR. They're very much the same gun, but different. Some parts were under change. The whole metric versus inch thing is a little bit of a misnomer. Sometimes the centimeters will interchange, sometimes they won't. Obviously this folding handle would not readily fit on this and vice versa and it still be fully functional. Things like that are different, including the magazines. The metric versus inch mag is one of the most visible, important differences. That's because you need to know what gun you have, what mags it takes, so when you go to buy mags. And in the US, at least for the last many years, metric mags have been much more gettable than inch mags. But the inch mag is really better because this is part of the product improvements from the commission. Note the front big old lug versus that tiny little stamped out dimple. That's pretty evident. But another thing, the base plate. This one's just folded over, relatively thin. This one actually goes out the sides and is held on with more of a spring button. It's not one of those differences you hear talked about frequently, but it's actually a pretty important one, and I really think it helps keep the mag from damage quite a bit. So it is a better magazine. Now, of course, because of this front lug, you have a situation where an inch mag will absolutely not fit in a metric gun, but a metric mag will fit in an inch gun, although you're going to have a gap, especially because of the locking area, and this one fits pretty tight, but some won't. I've noticed these mags in general in this pouch are kind of on the wider end of spec, but some metric mags, if you put them in an inch mag well, will wiggle around quite a bit, which could cause feeding problems. So if you have an inch cut receiver, look up in here. Metric mags will fit, probably will work, but better to use the inch if you have them. But if you flip it over and you only have a metric gun, you need the metric mags. Another difference with accessories is with the bayonet. Designed for this little lug, we have a much more conventional bayonet for the L1A1. Pretty conventional scabbard too, although very heavy. Overall, the British bayonet is shorter than the Israeli. The blades are almost the same, but the hilts, because of the spring, are a little different. This is just a much simpler and therefore more durable and cheaper bayonet. And you do get a little bit longer reach because of the flash hider, and also because you don't have these prongs. So probably a more effective bayonet too. It does look cool. So the British would test this for a number of years, officially adopting it in 1957 as the Venerable Lee Enfield's replacement. By this time, Canada was already producing them. The Canadian Small Arms Cow, the long branch successor, was making them there. They would go from the C1 to the C1A1 and even the C1A1D, which was a select fire variant for the Navy there. Around the same time, Australia would adopt it as the L1A1, same name as the British. Essentially the same model, just different wood furniture and a green carry handle instead of black polymer. And these would start production in 1959 at Lithgow. As for the UK, you'd have the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield building them. You would have Birmingham Small Arms, BSA, and you would have Fazakerley. So there would be 3 main factories with a 4th making some as well. And primary production was from the very late 50s through the 1960s and into the early 70s. Even though these would actually stay in service until the early 90s, they would just keep refurbishing older guns like this one here and keeping them around because it is a dependable, durable system. And that's really one of the benefits of the FN FAL for any variant. These are very upgradable, very solid. You can really just refinish them, redo them, rebarrel them if you need to. They're very easy to work on. There's not a lot of stampings, very few welds, not a lot of rivets. Most things are screwed on. So yeah, replacing is pretty dang easy. So the Brits would use these, like I said, earliest Suez does more testing. They'd use them in the Malayan emergency. They would send some down and they'd be used in South Africa, other areas in Africa. They of course would be seen in the Troubles in North Ireland and all that stuff quite extensively, and probably most famously be used in 1982 during the Falklands War. It was still very much the standard gun at the time, but we'll come back to that. And even though it was officially replaced by 1990-1991 by the L85, when Britain went back to the bullpup idea, several L1A1s were pulled back out for use in Desert Storm and Iraq, because in a lot of ways this was the FAL meant for dusty, dry, Sahara desert environments. And really, based on what we see, it did work better for the British in those environments than it did for the Israelis. But then again, different combat tactics and different things, so it's really hard to compare. It's almost apples to oranges, but I would mention it just in case. And of course, Australia would use their own L1A1 SLR in Vietnam. We'll come back to that as well. In New Zealand, while they adopted this gun, would not produce theirs. They would just buy theirs from Lithgow in Australia. So it really was quite the Commonwealth rifle. Heck, even India made an unlicensed copy, the 1A1, which I will be able to show you one someday, but unfortunately it wasn't able to make it into this video as I'd originally hoped. But c'est la vie, correct? By the way, the cleaning kit, there's no compartment in the polymer stock. The original wood ones did have a small one, but they actually carried these in a little tobacco can as part of their gear. And this is the more or less standard sling, essentially a carryover from the Enfield. But I guess, hey, if it works, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, right? God, this is one of my favorite guns. And do note the receiver cuts. It is a Type 1, but it's a British Type 1. They simplified the machining process a bit because they were intended on making quite a few of these. And they did, and they served the British well for 40 years? Yeah, about 40 years. And are fondly looked upon today. So, what if you want an L1A1 in the USA? Well, the good news is this was meant to be a semi-auto from the beginning, hence the SLR name. The bad news is, by and large, they weren't allowed to import because of the auto sear cut and all of that. But as anyone who follows the channel knows, this is one of my favorite guns for what it is. And really how these kind of came in. We've already talked about the kind of grandfathering of some things, and we'll continue to see it, and this is another good example. In the 1990s, really during the assault weapons ban period, or right around that era, some L1A1 SLRs were brought over as surplus. Britain had started phasing them out in 1985-86 in favor of the L85A1, and this phase out would be complete by 1994. So these would be surplus guns, and they were brought over here for purchase by LEOs, law enforcement officers, and they were private purchase. Basically, they were just in a catalog they could buy, and they were let in as Title I guns intended only for the law enforcement market. But they weren't marked as such. They weren't marked restricted, and they were just Title I guns. And since these were private purchase by officers, not by departments, after the officers retired or passed away or just got tired of guns in general, they could just sell them. I know 2 officers, at least in Arkansas, who did just this, and there's nothing against it. So they kind of got out into the market, and they're perfectly legal. They were approved. It's been years. No one said anything. I think that's just because it was another oopsie, another oversight that works in our favor, and it was a relatively small number. I've seen 200 is a number brought over. I think it's larger than that just because I've seen a few of these in my life. Could be wrong, could just be a lot of guns being cycled. One thing that is interesting, they all seem to be BSA marked guns. I've not seen an infield. In my theory, and this is just a pure guess theory, BSA was still a private company, Birmingham, whereas Infield was a nationally owned organization. I wonder if when these are sold off, it was okay to sell off the private made guns, but not the ones made under the crown. This did happen with Sterling's. For example, Sterling Arms Corporation could sell their semi-automatic submachine gun types, but the ones made by Infield only went to the about to say Red Army, to the Redcoats, to the Royal Army. I don't know, just thought I'd point that out. If you've seen one that isn't BSA, let me know. Now, interestingly, there is another variant that came in much smaller numbers with this batch. Some Indian 1A1s seem to have come over in the same batch, probably via England. And the Indian 1A1 is an interesting unlicensed clone or copy of the mostly inch L1A1, but it had some metric features too done at the Ishapur factory. And that's what I hope to show you in this video because a friend happened to find one, but it'll just make its own video next year. It'll probably be even better for that, being able to really look at the Indian gun. But a few Indian guns came over too. I've heard tell that a few Canadian C1s came in with this batch, but I haven't been able to verify that. Every time I track one down, it ends up not being a actual Canadian C1, but something else. So, thought I'd point that out. This is also one of the few guns where the import mark matters. It's on the barrel, it's a Century Arms mark, and that kind of lets you know that this is one of the grandfathered in guns. And what's funny, they don't sell for nearly what the G-series guns do. Yet, to my mind, they're even more authentic. But let's say you miss out on one of the LEO L1A1 SLRs. Well, there's plenty of options. Mini kits came over. In fact, you started to see inch kits, Australian and British, come over before a lot of the metric kits. Unfortunately, a lot of these came over before I really got into FALs. I kind of caught the tail end of the British kit wave, which was started in the early to mid 90s and pretty much was gone by the early 21st century, 2003, 2004. They started to really dry up. But that's when a lot of the metrics kits came in, the G1, the StG 58. Anyway, you can definitely do a kit build. And they mostly have the barrels because they came in before the 2005 barrel ban cut off. That's the good news. The bad news is building an L1A1 Australian or British is a little more difficult. You still have your locking shoulder back here, but you also have a breeching washer for the barrel, which times your barrel. So you need the proper washer and locking shoulder to get everything headspace correctly. A little bit more complexity there, not too bad, but there you go. Just one of those many differences. Also, inch receivers. Can you put one on a metric? Yes, you can. A lot of M-bell receivers were used. In fact, Century Arms did quite a few L1A1 sporters, importing them with thumbhole stocks, so post 1989, using Australian and British kits. In fact, this is where the rumor of a lot of Canadian guns come from, because a lot of these L1A1 thumbhole stock guns are marked Canada, because they were assembled in Canada, but they were assembled using Australian and British parts on Brazilian M-bell receivers. So if you see a Type 3 looking L1A1, that's not a British gun or Australian. They used receivers with this style of lightning cut, and they were all basically modified Type 1s, not Type 3s. But you can definitely do a kit build. Unfortunately, not as many manufacturers did inch receivers in America as compared with metric. So if you do one, you kind of have to resort to receivers like this. Since I happen to have one in the store, even though it's sold and I'm about ready to go out, I thought we'd talk about Century Arms and kind of US cast receivers versus the British up here. Honestly, for a while, until DSA did a run or two, these were really about your only choice for an inch style receiver. Now, they don't have the lightning cut, but they do have the cut for the handle, and they are cut out internally for the inch mag, and they were intended for an inch pattern barrel with the washer. And a lot of these were made by Hess. Now, that's not the best recommend, if I'm being honest, but honestly, the problem with the Hess receivers, they were cast, yes, but they weren't known for breaking. They were just really difficult to build with. So if you got a bare Hess receiver, a virgin Hess receiver, and built on it, you'd have to do a lot of fitting. I remember the guide rails, yes, because when I first did an L1A1 build myself, this is the only receiver I could find, and that's what I did. And just like the guide rails weren't straight inside, you had to kind of file them to fit other parts. Once you got them together and you got everything working and the bolt not binding, they were okay. Again, probably not a go-to-war gun, but they were alright. It's what we had. Now later, Century started doing some cast receivers with just Century Arms on them in-house, and those were allegedly, if I remember correctly, made by DCI, which was Dan Coonan, the Coonan receivers, and they were, at least at one time, the best cast you could get. It actually makes me truly sad that the Coonan thing ended the way it did, because for a time they were quite a bit cheaper than a DSA, and more importantly, you didn't have to get on a wait list. You could just pick one up or order one, and it would come quite quickly for a couple $100 at a time when DSAs and M-bells were $350 to $450. And again, they were good cast receivers, a little tight, but you know, they were better than the Hess, but they didn't always do an inch pattern. In fact, frankly, often they didn't. Flipping it over, it does have a bit of a lightning cut on the magwell at least. So the magwell looks more like this than that. I don't know. I just had this in the store that I'd show you, a Century put together gun. These would come after the thumbhole stock guns. The thumbhole stock guns would dry up because of import changes and post 1997. So they would start building them here. Of course, during the assault weapons ban, you couldn't have this muzzle device. After you could. Anyway, I don't know. It was here, I thought I'd show it. But we did have one serviceable, if not great, cast receiver. But hey, at least it wasn't a hand grenade. For those who know, you know, there was an attempt in America to do a aluminum alloy receiver, and oh boy, if you get an upper alloy receiver FAL, run. So the Hess was better than those, and the Kunin was better than the Hess. Of course, today Kunin's gone, Hess is gone, and DSA is still here, but now, for the most part, they're doing cast receivers. It's just modern technology. What can you do about it? But I don't want to dog on cast too much because, like I said, after 1977, until they pretty much wrapped up production at the end of the 80s, FN Herstal used casting as well. But, yeah, just a quick little comparison of an original and a kit build. Really pretty furniture on this one. This Marinale furniture replaced the original walnut in the 1970s. I should point out that even after like BSA and Enfield stopped making all new guns, Parker Hale in the UK would make replacement parts and service parts for these guns through the 70s and into the Falklands War period. Because after all, the L1A1 wasn't phased out until after Desert Storm, at least not entirely. So, moving on from there, you can do a build, and they're really worthwhile to do, even if you have to use those receivers. The challenge is not really in that they're dangerous, it's just in the building. So, yeah, that I would just share that. Well, we moved from effectively what was the first generation to the second. A series of guns that would be the first adaptations of the FAL. And this would be great if I had a West German Federal Border Guard, a BGS gun to show you. But I don't. I still have my good old trusty Gewehr G1. But it's a good jumping off spot to talk about, you know, West Germany and the FAL. In 1950, the BGS, the Border Guard, was being formed. By 1951 it existed, really with Allied insistence. It was the first federal, national agency, but it was civilian operated, basically a police force or paramilitary. And it started off quite small, about 10,000 men, but it would grow to 20 and 30,000 and so on and so forth. And originally they would use, in the BGS, World War II era surplus weapons with some German and some American thrown in, carbines and the like. But by 1954, things were changing. Obviously, the Allies wanted West Germany to be a bulwark against any communist front coming west. And for one thing, the Bundeswehr would be established in 1955, and the BGS would be expanded. And they wanted new guns, and in 1955 they purchased their first FN FALs from Fabrique Nationale. And you know how I said that FN was allowing basically any allies to have free license to manufacture the FAL? That did not apply to West Germany. Can't imagine why. The BGS started off ordering about 115 kind of sample guns, and these would be Model A's, so-called Canadian patterns. They had bare barrels, standard tall sights, wood handguards, a few minor mods from the actual Canadian C1, but that's where they started off from. This would progress in 1956 to the first really major batch. They would purchase 2,000 guns. These would be almost the same, but they would have T-48 style flash hitters pinned on the barrels, and they would actually end up doing an upgrade program for these older guns, the Model AF, where they would very first install a kind of a clamp-on bipod and eventually metal handguards. This would lead to another purchase of roughly 5,000 guns, give or take, and it eventually transitioned more to a Model B style by 1956-57. And so these would be the BGS guns. They would have the standard tall sights, and they would start to have flash hiders, things of that nature. So what about the G1? Well, the Bundeswehr, as it was forming in 1955, had ideas about where it really wanted to go, but it needed an interim rifle for the, at the time, new 7.62 NATO cartridge. So they too started looking at the FN FAL, and they would go with the G1 pattern here, with most of the guns delivered 1957, 1958, although trials were conducted earlier. And they would acquire roughly 100,000, and they were pretty much all of this pattern. And there were a few major differences between the BGS guns and the G1. For one, and this is actually very important going forward, these are the first guns with the low sights. They lowered them by about 3 millimeters, which doesn't sound like much, but as you can see, it really does matter. This kept them from getting banged up as much. Solid front sight. And it also had the shooter's head kind of down on the stock a little better. Another change from the BGS guns, they went from wood carry handles and pistol grips as a norm to the plastic. Interestingly, this style does not have the cleaning kit compartment like the Israeli. At least the original ones had the alloy cocking handle. And unlike the FALs you looked at so far, these actually did have a three-way selector switch. Safe, semi, and full. Now, of course, on a semi-auto receiver, just so it's out there, the full is moot. They went to a standard sheet steel, pressed steel handguard, and a standard folding bipod. Early ones would have Type B stocks. Later we get the C type here. And unlike the Israelis, these did have a small storage compartment in the back for kind of an emergency cleaning kit. Normally they would carry in the belt, but you know, they had a spot there. Sling swivel. This is a German sling. They used pretty much standard 20-round mags, although, if memory serves, they actually had some of the alloy 20-round mags, too. One's often considered Paratrooper mags. I think the West Germans had some, but I could be wrong on that. Pretty standard Type 1 receiver. Pretty standard polymer carry handle, the small style. But the barrel is an interesting pattern on the G1 here. While your early BGS guns could have a bare muzzle with the lug here, most of them had your T48s. With your G1s, at first this might look like the same pattern, but actually the lug here has been ever so slightly moved. So the barrel is a different dimension from here to here. They moved the lug forward. They also beefed up the crown a bit from the earlier style. And this is pretty interesting for the G1 pattern because it let us really attach different muzzle devices. For example, we have a grenade spigot that can go on the lug. It's one device. Because the Army was new and training was very important, a blank fire device was also made. But of course, the standard device, the one we see most often, is the quick install and detach flash hider, inspired by the T48 pattern, but meant for the slug. Here's two different styles. This one has the spring on it. And of course, they just snap right on. Basically, you just put it on, and then, if I can do it single-handed, probably not, twist. Easy enough to do, with two hands. It's only about 90 degrees and fits surprisingly tight. Interesting idea to be able to just snap on something to your barrel in the field. One interesting thing, if you look on the bottom, there is a flat spot here, and some have said that was for a potential bayonet. I'm not sure if that's true, but one thing that is true, the G1 was never issued with a bayonet. But we do have the sling here, the original sling, and here is a West German mag pouch. Pretty much the same style for the later G3, the Gewehr 3. But at first, they used these beginning in the late 50s through the early to mid 60s. Again, they picked up 100,000. As is famously known, FN was not keen on letting West Germany manufacture these in-country, domestically. And to be fair, West Germany wasn't all that interested. Did they broach the subject? Yes, they did. But I am kind of skeptical about their sincerity, if I'm being honest. Either way, of course, by 1959, these would be officially replaced by the G3, and eventually mustered out and transferred to Turkey, which is kind of where a lot of German guns have ended up over the years. But it is important. This is a true metric style, again, Type 1 receiver, and it's really the first pattern that introduced the low or short sight bases, and a few other things besides. And there are a few variations in these, especially when you kind of combine. The BGS also acquired several G1 styles. It's said that in total the BGS had about 30,000 FALs, including the original ones. Some of those would be ex-Bundeswehr, others would just be obtained from FN. It's a little murky, but it's a cool variant worth talking about. And it directly inspired our next one, which is yet another very important FN FAL. Since this is a longer video, I want to do a second one, shorter, answering your questions. Several were posed to me, specific questions about which is better, what's this or that, what's the difference. So look for that. Before or after this long one, I'll do more of a direct comment video, for example, talking about the mags. Someone asked about the best rear sight, things of that nature, including receivers. Just thought I'd put a little plug in, because I thought about putting it in this video, but I was afraid it would get lost in the sauce. Progressing directly from the West German G1, we come to the Austrian Steyr Sturmgewehr model 1958, StG 58. And while it wasn't this particular gun here, one of these was actually my first FAL that I owned, but not the first one I shot, of course. And talking about geopolitics, Austria's position in the late 40s and 50s was interesting. It could have gone either way. That's a story for another day. But ultimately, it was decided that instead of labeling them as collaborators with Nazi Germany, they would be treated more like an occupied and annexed nation, which is why FN in Belgium kind of had a different attitude towards them. And while we have this relatively unique gun here that served for decades. In 1956, Austria was looking for a new service rifle for its federal military, the Bundesheer, and really focused in on the FAL and work done with the G1 over here. And after testing and trials, a modified version was picked in 1958. And it does borrow quite heavily from the metric and thus the G1. For example, the stamped handguards, the folding bipod, although we should point out that the handguards are slightly different in their pattern. And while this uses the same kind of folding light bipod, The hinge now has roller plungers instead of just direct contact on the G1. A much better design for longevity and what have you. They copied the shorter sights and essentially the same carry handle and the same basic pistol grip, but they went to a new style of buttstock. Now originally this would have been wood, but later on in production and older guns during replacements, we get a new plastic one. But they did away with the hump, the whale hump on the back, so a straighter comb. And they also went to a rubber butt pad without trapdoor. I can appreciate why on both. But of course, the most distinctive feature is the stole flash hider. It might appear as if the StG 58 has a shorter barrel, but it doesn't. This flash hider just comes back on the barrel. It's still a 21-inch barrel. It actually doesn't stick out too far. This is named after Major Stoll, who was part of the purchasing commission that selected the FAL and suggested modifications. He came up with this combination device. It acts as a 4-prong type flash hider, which also can be used as a wire cutter. It's even internally threaded to accept a blank firing device for training, and it has a ring here for a rifle grenade. What it doesn't have is a bayonet lug. The Austrian Bundesheer did not issue bayonets then or later with the StG 77. To work with the rifle grenade, they improved the gas plug. So let's flip that over. They added this inverted L-shaped piece, so it was much easier for disassembly and to set for rifle grenade launching. It's a marked improvement, it really is. And you see a lot of those small but important changes. For example, started with the G1 and carried it over here. We have an improved firing pin and extractor. As these guns start to see field use and they kind of figure out what does and doesn't work, we still have a vertical takedown catch, still a 3-position. Small differences in the bolt release. It's actually a 2-piece design, mag catch, pretty much standard steel mags. And now we have a plastic charging handle instead of the earlier metal style, and we actually use a modified Mauser type sling, which makes sense considering, well, Austria had a bunch of them. And to go with the sling, we have this pretty cool leather pebble grain pouch. There's several minor variations, but generally speaking, this was the pouch that they used. I like it. Kind of leaves the top of the mag exposed, easy to grab, but it protects the bottom. Most FAL pouches just held 2 mags. You'll find some that will hold 3, but usually those are for G3s actually. But like I said, the original stock was wood, but would soon go to the plastic, and that's because of the whole production with these guns. In 1958, FN would build the first 20,000 or so StG 58s for Austria, and these would typically have a blued finish. But the idea from the get-go was for Steyr to tool up and start making these. And they started making some parts by 1959, and they would slowly switch over by 1960, 1961 to more and more in-house parts. And FN would switch from shipping complete guns to parts. So it's a process. You'll find some pure FN Belgian guns. You'll find some built from FN parts in Austria, some built from FN parts and Steyr parts in Austria, and then finally by the 60s we have pure Steyr guns. And these have the desirable barrel that people like. There's a bit of a myth, but it's harmless, that the cold hammer forged barrels that Steyr used are particularly accurate. Interestingly, they never were chrome lined. And only the last 30,000 even had a chrome plated chamber. So the majority of these were not chromed. Now the finish could be blued, as I said. It can be phosphated, parkerized, or it can be the paint over park. And they used all three types of receiver. Type 1, which we've been looking at, and here this gun is built on a Type 2 receiver. This is reinforced in the back. This was done because some guns being fired extensively on full auto developed stress here, so they beefed up the receiver in this area. And Type 1 and Type 2 were produced concurrently starting around 1961-62 if memory serves. And Steyr would do them all. And they would continue to build guns even up to the replacement, which was again the Steyr AUG in 1977, with the final batch leaving the factory by 1980, 1981. And they would build over 170,000, under 175,000. It's a little murky, but in that range. So not quite twice as many G1s. The number could have been higher, but Steyr either didn't have the license or the will, just didn't want to export these. These were made all for the Austrian military, and maybe some police forces, but mostly the military. And therefore were all peacetime guns. So the only wear and tear they really ever got was just storage, training, what have you. That means that the kits we got were in really good shape. And just generally speaking, the machining, be it on the Belgian made or the Austrian made, was just, you know, really, really nice. And these are very thoughtful made guns. And of course there are many other variants made for many other nations besides. But this kind of gets us through the 1950s. So what if you want to own an StG 58 or a Gewehr 1 in the US as semi-autos? Now, these were both select fire guns, always and forever for the most part. So you couldn't just import them over. Let's start with the G1. Essentially, you're stuck with kit builds. That's the bad news. The good news is kits have been pretty common and prevalent for 25 years. Most guns that served in the Bundeswehr ended up going to Turkey. So, yeah, condition can be a little sus, and sometimes I've seen some interesting Turkish-made parts, for example, pistol grips. You can also get the BGS, the Federal Border Guard guns, and those can be quite interesting. Kind of wish I had one, but I've just never found a gun or a kit that quite hit my fancy. So you're going to have to build them on something. And, well, you see mine's on a DSA Type 1. You could do one on an imbel, but since the imbels are Type 3s, that would not have been correct. These guns were all made before not only the Type 3 came out, but even the Type 2, because they were delivered primarily in 1957, 1958, some going back to 1956. The Type 2s did not come out until, well, 1962, and were not a straight replacement. So the hard part with these is a lot of kits came in after 2005, and so the barrel ban. And as we've already looked at, the G1 had a unique barrel. Of course, U.S. makers can do a version of, but if you can find a kit with a good barrel, good bore, that's the way to go. And they're kind of fun because a lot of the small parts have the German acceptance stamp and all that. And a good friend built this gun up for me, and it's about as good as I could really do a G1 build. Of course, there is one other very famous way to get one of these, but you gotta have deep pockets. That's right, the infamous G series. These were imported by Browning Arms Corporation, the first really FN importers back in the 60s, and they started off as contract overruns. I think a lot of them were guns that could not be delivered to Cuba, but they were basically, well, G1 style guns, hence the G series, that were converted to semi-auto only in England by Parker Hale and then brought over here as semi-automatics. But they got caught up in that once a machine gun, always a machine gun thing, and therefore in court. They would wind their ways through the court system. I don't believe it was really settled all the way until 1972, when it was ruled that they were grandfathered in. They were imported They were approved by the IRS, the predecessor of the ATF, or U.S. Customs. They were sold here. They were bought here on good faith. Basically, they said it wasn't the customer's fault that the government let them through. Plus, back then, the once a machine gun, always a machine gun wasn't as strictly adhered to. So, eventually, 1,836 were grandfathered in by serial. Now, I will give a warning. If you get a G series, make sure before you buy it, it is one of the ones on the list, because some in that serial range have snuck in probably via the Canadian border, but there are some G series guns that aren't on the serial range, and you really need them to be on that serial range to be the grandfathered in. What's the big deal? Really not much, except they have the auto sear cut out. They're still semi-auto only. No, you cannot convert them to full auto legally because they're considered Title I non-papered guns. Now, could you do it surreptitiously? Yes, but you're breaking the law. So the G series is a thing. Now, what are they going for? I don't have any to sell, but I will say that one's at a local gun shop I know on consignment, and the owner wants $18,000. In the past, they were easily $6,000 to $9,000. To me, it's not worth it, because the only difference is you're getting a modified FN receiver. Would it be cool to have one? Absolutely, but not for that coin. That one we have, better options. But what about the Sturmgewehr 1958? Well, if you want a semi-automatic StG 58, this is the best option. You get a parts kit. Most of the kits that came in were in great shape because they came straight out of Austria after these were surplused out. And you put it on a DSA receiver. That's because DSA is as good as it gets and essentially is a Steyr Austrian receiver. Let me explain for those who aren't aware. For those who are, well, bear with me for 5 minutes. In the 1990s, Steyr of Austria, post-Cold War, was looking to sell off the StG 58 production line, not to mention just a bunch of parts and things they had. And in 1995, a company, DS Arms, DS being the initials of its founder and owner, struck a deal with them to buy pretty much everything. They took about 40 tons of just stuff, parts. They also bought the entire production line for receivers, barrels, what have you, blueprints, tooling, notes. Keep in mind, Steyr got all their stuff from FN Herstal back in the late 50s too. So there's a direct connection there. And so DS Arms, DSA, would set up production in America and introduce the SA-58 to the market as early as 1997. At this time, they were mostly built with leftover Austrian parts, but on a new USA-made receiver. And these receivers were forged. In fact, early on, they were done by LMT on behalf of DS Arms. These will have Grace Lake markings, later Lake Barrington, and they would do tens of thousands over the years. And they're about as good as it gets outside of an import, because they're built with the original know-how and tooling, and LMT was a quality company, and frankly, DS Arms was a quality company at this time for sure. So my thought was, well, if you're going to get an StG 58 kit, the best receiver for it is a DS Arms, because Steyr never sold semi-autos to the US or anywhere. In fact, they never exported their guns, aside from parts kits. So that, to me, is where to go. Now, a lot of people built the 58 kits on MBEL receivers, Type 3s. That's fine. It just looks a little odd to me. And I say that because it just does. But, to be fair, late production Steyr guns could be on a Type 3 receiver, but in that case, you'd have the corresponding correct lower. I had my friend, someone who built this one, he built this on a Type 2. I just thought that was neat, so I gotta have a Type 2 in the collection. To be fair, Steyr did make some Type 2 guns as well. Now this is a blued gun. It isn't parts matching, but it's such a good shooter. It does have the original barrel. My friend built it for me. It has some sentimental value, and I do like that it's on a DSA Type 2, because DSA would start doing quite a wide range of receiver variants for the market, even some limited collector's runs, including one for the South African R1. That's my ideal R1, would be a DSA South African pattern receiver with an original kit, good barrel, good bore. I'm holding out for that. So we'll see if I ever get one. That's my opinion, and that's why also for like a G1 build, I think a DSA receiver, sorry, I moved my hand over too far. I think a DSA receiver is the way to go, because it is built with essentially FN tooling and blueprints. And if you do one, I would definitely do a Type 1 for this, because really nothing else quite works. But yeah, there are no StG 58 semi-automatic pre-ban imports, unfortunately. Those that follow the channel know that my single favorite manufacturer of FN FALs is probably Argentina FM AP, DGFM, Rosario. That's not to say I don't think the L1A1 is my favorite individual gun, but the range that Argentina did is very impressive, and for a long time these were sleepers. You could really pick them up a lot cheaper than Belgian, sometimes even cheaper than Brazilian. But we're unfortunately going to have to jump forward again. I don't really have a good example of a transitional gun from the early/mid 60s. This one here is, well, it's obviously made in the 80s, but it's a good representative of a 1970s era gun. And the design would see quite a few refinements and improvements to material. And where does Argentina kind of join in? In 1953, the nation was looking to adopt its next generation service rifle, and they actually set about copying the M1 Grand, logical, the StG 44, also logical, and of all things, the 1941 Johnson. Okay. And so they were going to build these in-house, try them out in 1954, but they start realizing things are changing around the world. So in 1955, many in Argentina were getting interested in the FAL. So in September of that year, they actually halted the program at the time and allowed for the FAL to be inserted into their trials. And it quickly stomped everything, and by the end of that year, they shelved the idea of an M1 Grand, a Johnson, even an StG 44. No, they're going to go with the FAL, and they started working with FN in Belgium. And it would take a little time, but in 1958 they would receive their first guns made by FN themselves, but they wanted a license to produce, and this started at the FMAP factory in Rosario, as I mentioned, as early as 1960. And again, there's traditional guns. Obviously, the first Argentinian guns would be on Type 1 or Type 2 receivers. And the first ones would, of course, have wood furniture, and then later wood buttstocks. And the new pattern of polymer handguard was introduced. Some with bipod cuts, some without. This one happens to have it. One holdover that Argentinian guns had from the early days, it retained the tall sights. Even laid on. This has the horizontal takedown, and it has the Type 3 receiver. We already talked about Type 2 coming in, limited use in 1962. Around 1973, FN in Belgium, and this would be carried over to other manufacturers, went to the Type 3. Essentially, it was the same receiver, they just quit doing all the fancy lightning cuts. This also had the benefit of making it stronger. So it was stronger and faster to produce, a little bit heavier, but oh well. They even reworked the lower. You'll notice the edge here versus here. So it looked nice and went alongside. Some other things that the Argentinian guns, they had the later style, kind of larger finger groove carry handle, polymer charging handle, gas regulator, center cutoff here, but you'll notice there's no lug on the barrel. This has the combo device. The StG up here had a thread-on device that went back on the barrel. This was 13 millimeter, roughly 9/16 left hand. And by the 60s, the lugged barrel was out and a new combo device was in. And there'd be kind of an early proto version and then a more refined version. This was pretty neat. It acted as a flash hider and a grenade launcher mount for 22 millimeter. It was internally threaded for a blank fire device, and it was notched on the bottom for a new, simple, lightweight bayonet. Here is one such example. Note the polymer scabbard, pretty NATO standard frog, and it would go right on. The handle is a little more than a hollow tube that goes around the device and has ports for the flash hider slots. And then you have a very simple tubular inspired bayonet. There's several variations and types. I just picked one out of my box at random. Very lightweight, very simple. You can tell by this point the whole idea of a bayonet's kind of falling out. Again, the 58 up here never even had one. Some users still wanted one, at least on paper, so FN gave them this. Yeah, not much to it, but pretty cool. And this device would really spread amongst the nations. This combo device, this barrel shaped device, really was a good notion. In fact, since we're talking about it, let's bring the Israeli back out, because they would actually thread the end of their muzzles and put a version of this on there. You can find some Israeli barrels without anything on. You can find some that have the lug and the barrel-shaped device on there, which means the lug is effectively worthless. And you can find some later IMI barrels that don't have the lug at all and just have the combination device. And yeah, here we have the progression from my earliest metric to one on a type 2 to a full type 3. And Argentina will continue to build this pattern, known in country as a type 1, throughout the 1970s and 80s. Yes, through the Falklands War. And really it doesn't seem like they ended full production until the early to mid 1990s. Note that even though this has the rubber butt plate, which would become standard on most FALs, it doesn't have the hump. So if you want to tell an StG from other standard stock, look for the whale hump or lack thereof. This also has the full rotating rear sling swivel. A lot of earlier guns wouldn't. Again, there's so many variations in FALs, and this is just an overview video. But with dozens upon dozens of nations adopting these, many even making them in-house, and FN always happy and willing to customize, the variations are nearly infinite. Here's an Argentine sling on this one too. Big, heavy honking leather deal. This has the later style bipod with a bit of a quick detach feature. The pin you can pull, whereas earlier bipods like this are staked on with a castle nut. So yeah, these are our 50.00 guns. But before we move on, we have to go back in time a bit. We're still going to stay with Argentina. All the way back to where this video began with the FN FN 49, because Argentina was one of the purchasers, and they were a late purchaser. It wasn't until about mid-1953 that they placed their own contract. And this is actually important because between 1949 and 1952, FN made several small but important product improvements to the FN 49 design, including to things like the firing pin. So these late pattern guns really built in the last couple of years of standard production, not counting the Indonesian contract, will be a little different. And they were placed not for the Argentinian Army, but for the Navy. And they would order over 5,500. Some sources say 5,536, some say 5,541, and others give numbers in between. Either way, you get the idea. Not a tiny contract, not a huge one. And they would be delivered quite rapidly. And they were chambered for 7.65 by 53. A cartridge that actually goes back to Belgium, but today we identify with Argentina. And they were for the Navy, like I said. But this gun here, of course, is not chambered for that. At least, not now. In the mid-60s, after the FAL was adopted, by the way, in Spanish, FAL is still FAL compared to French. Different words, same acronym. FAL, if you prefer. After it was already adopted in Argentina and even being produced, the Navy wanted to update their guns. After all, they hadn't seen a lot of service, and for shipboard operations, yeah, why not? But they didn't contract with FN in Belgium. They actually had an Argentinian company do the planning, the design, the work itself. And you might think they would make them take 20 round detaching FAL mags. For whatever reason, I have to feel it has to be logistics. They actually ended up making a whole new mag that is proprietary to this 7.62 NATO FN49 conversion. To make it work, they had to give a mag catch, of course, modifying the trigger guard and, all this down here. And they installed an all-new Argentinian barrel, although many of the other parts are still original to the gun. These have a large trapdoor in the buttstock, semi-pistol grip. The charging handle is not checkered. And there are several other things, like the tape down on the back is thicker, but also blockier without a lot of patterning. Again, the mag is an interesting mag. It actually can be loaded by FAL guides, but not much else is interchangeable. Same front sight, same bayonet lug. And again, it has a threaded muzzle, but just with a end cap on. And these had the paint over phosphate finish, much like the FALs. So work began on converting these guns in the late 60s, and the program seems to have lasted into the early 70s. I don't know how many of the original 5,500 were converted. It seems like the vast majority were. And no new guns were made. These are all conversions. So meaning 5,000 or fewer of these were made, and they were placed in the Navy. Some were used maybe by the Marines, but many were just kept on board ships or even shore stations. But they were technically in service during the Falklands War, 1982, and even did potentially see a little bit of combat, or at least combat adjacent action. They also seem to have made quite a few spare mags for these. I'm not pulling it out again because YouTube, but the mags are actually quite available. At least they were for years, much more so than the rifles. Tiny side note, they also updated some of their old M1 Grands to the BM59E standard. That work was done by Beretta. So, yeah, they had some magazine-fed M1 Grand types too. Kind of an interesting hodgepodge. Really cool gun. And this was the 5th major caliber for the FN49 7.62 by 51, but the work was not pioneered or done by FN Herstal, although they had some prototypes early on. Yeah, I just wanted to mention it since we were talking Argentina. And that concludes our standard 50.00 FN FALs. But on the other hand, we're really just getting started. So earlier we talked about the standard FN49 owning in America. What about our Argentine Navy conversion? Well, the first major batch of these came in 1995, with a second major batch around 2003. The issue with these guns, this was during the federal assault weapons ban. Hey, it's a cat. And the problem there is these had too many evil features: bayonet lug, threaded barrel, and detaching mag. Now eventually they would be declared CNR and that wouldn't be a problem, but for a while these weren't CNR guns. Keep in mind, 1995, even 2003, these were not 50 years old. 2003 they finally were after the end of that year, so they started to be, but 95 they weren't. My point is, I've actually seen some of these lightly neutered, typically having the muzzle cap permanently attached, but I've seen a couple with the bayonet lug ground off. Quite luckily, these were actually imported with quite large numbers of the 20-round Argentine-made mags, which is good because it's a proprietary mag. We're just lucky that they ended up making several for this gun, because there's only, 5,000 or so conversions, maybe even fewer. Those mags could be incredibly rare, and they probably would be if they fit anything else, but they don't. So you'd think getting a mag for one of these would be difficult. It's really not. But finding the gun, yeah, it's not the easiest. But they did come in a couple of batches, so there will be a few minor things, but luckily most of them are in really good shape. And I think it's one of the coolest variants because it is different. It's also a good example of a late production. As I mentioned earlier, around 1952, FN had made several changes to the FN-49 design to both streamline production and to make it a more durable gun. And some of the other late ones, for example, the Indonesian contract guns, we've never had mass importation of. So if you want a late style gun compared to, say, an early style like the Egyptian we talked about earlier, it's another cool way. I just think it's a neat gun. But what do you think? What would be your favorite? As I mentioned earlier too, my first FN-49 was Venezuelan, and I wish I didn't have to sell it when I did, but without it I might not have been able to start Ozark Bear Arms, my business. So needs must, guys. Needs must. And I've had several Luxembourgians, as I mentioned. They're very cool, very neat, a lot of serial numbers on them. But man, the price has just skyrocketed. It's just what it is, guys. So I kept my two favorites. The FN-49 because it matches my Argentinian collection, and the Egyptian because, well, they saw real combat. And I think that's neat, and they're frankly among the more affordable variants out there today. Now it's time to move into the heavies. The heavy barrel FAL, or the FAL, the FAL, Fusil Automatique Lourd. This was intended as a light machine gun, effectively a squad support weapon, and I would hazard to guess that Israel, the IDF, was the first to put these into actual combat because some were spotted in 1956, the Suez Crisis. And whereas the standard FAL, the light barrel, was known as the Romat, this was known as the Macleon. And I've stuck the 20-round mag in it because that's what they used. I have never found any evidence, I could be wrong, that the 30-round mag was used by Israel. And considering the reputation the 30-round mag would get, especially with Australia, they were probably pretty smart going with the 20s. This would probably help keep overheating down, jamming down, and it allowed the saw gunner and the standard infantry to share mags, ammunition, because these would operate, these would provide cover fire, and just overall more sustained fire. That said, we still have a fixed barrel, and it is still just 21 inches, but it is much heavier all throughout, especially under the handguard. And there are several other changes, and just as with the Romats, these are initially built by FN Herstal in Belgium, but later on more and more parts would be made by IMI in Israel because these saw extensive use. Both versions were primary in the 6 Days War and continued on through the 60s and were still widespread in 1973, October, for the Yom Kippur War. It really wasn't until right at the time between 72 and 74 they even started to get phased out, and this would not be completed until at least 1982 and kept in reserve beyond. So let's look at the differences. Let's start with the butt plate. Interestingly, whereas a lot of the light barrels have the Model C or C-type ferrule, the heavy barrels don't. At least not the ones I've seen. And we do have a different butt stock. This has a standard flat metal butt plate. This actually has a metal butt plate, but it flips up to be used as a shoulder rest. Something taken from the M14, M15, that kind of deal. We have a non-rotating, at least on one axis, sling swivel. And interestingly, we have a different rear sight. The standard tall sight here is adjustable from 200 to 600 meters. For the heavy barrel, we have a longer ramp, and it's adjustable at to 700 meters. This should be on a Type 1 receiver, but because it's a 1980s build, it's on a Type 3, which actually doesn't bug me as much because it is meant to be a LMG. But let's talk about selectors. Early on, a lot of the Romat light barrels did have a three-way selector, but very, very quickly they realized that wasn't very great. So they put the limiter. Middle position is safe, down is semi, and you can't push it up. Well, a support weapon that is not capable of auto fire is not very useful. So middle is still safe. Up would be automatic. Although again, this being a semi-auto, this is built by Springfield in the 80s, so you know it's a semi-auto. And then down is semi. I actually think it's a pretty good idea in some ways. In others, I can see the kind of downfall, but to have the middle as your safety, I see where they're going for, and it's very distinctive up here. This has the large carry handle. Again, there was a small, or not carry, a charging handle. There was a small charging handle used in some of the light barrels. A friend has owed me one for like 10 years, so hasn't given it to me. The carry handle is different though. Here's a regular one. This one is on a thicker wire, and it's actually tilted forward, so you grab it under the, or above the gas tube rather than above the cover, and that's just to set off the weight. And then we get to the handguard, and it's a very similar pattern to the light barrel, but it's thicker. The spacer rings are actually only 180 degrees, and they clip on, they don't spin around. And all the Mac-Leons I've seen just have one ring. I could be wrong, but that's what I've seen. Now this one actually retains the FN open ear block. Not 100% sure the sling is correct for it. This is the longer sling meant for the L2, but I think it works well for this gun, so I put it on. My gun, my rules. But then we get to the end, and we have a T-48 inspired flash hider, and we have, of course, a connector for a bipod. Again, squad automatic weapon. Yeah, kind of need a bipod. I'm not going to say this is the official bipod pouch, but it did come from Numeric years ago as an Israeli pouch. It's repurposed from a different gun, but it actually holds the bipod very well. And getting in and out of vehicles, you can understand why you didn't want that thing hanging on and flopping about, because, well, it does just that. And a reason I definitely believe Numeric this came out of Israel, every time I stick this bipod in the pouch, when I pull it out, there's sand in it. I've had this pouch for probably 15 years. I still get sand out of it. This thing definitely saw desert use. So here's the bipod. Folded up. It just kind of sits here and rotates around. It has a limiter on top so it won't over rotate. And it just has a big screw. Very easy to install. And it's actually lighter than you'd think. It's actually a heavy gauge sheet steel welded together. plenty heavy duty for this gun, but some other FAL bipods are even heavier. But let's get it up. You know, I've had this gun for over 15 years, picking it up actually before I got married. And I never get tired of it. It is neat. It has definitely a been there, done that look. It's kind of an interesting thing because it's a kit gun, but it's a pre-bend kit gun. But we'll talk more about that in appropriate sections. It has the same kind of pistol grip with storage compartment for a cleaning kit. Like I said, this is a Type 3 receiver here. Standard top cover, handle, little dent in the handguard for that to fold into. Exposed gas tube. And your bipods out front. Not exactly a modern style. This is a beast of a gun. Although it's not any longer, well, it's out slightly longer because of the flash hider. But really about the same as any other gun. It is noticeably heavier. And I think it's really neat that this saw true combat. There's a lot of nations that went with the FAL just kind of used it around. But that said, we've talked about how 90 or even more nations have used the FAL, and it was built in over a dozen nations, but comparatively few actually built the heavy barrel. Now, let's use my Israeli heavy barrel to talk Springfield, importers of the MBEL. They signed the deal in 1985. I'm not sure if they brought over any besides samples that year, but beginning in 85, Springfield started selling the SAR 48. Now, we've done several videos on the Springfield SAR 3 and SAR 8s, their HK guns. Well, this was their FAL equivalent. And this was intended to be a lower cost alternative to Fabrique Nationale. And it really was, and in some ways the MBEL guns were better. Why do I say that? Well, Browning started bringing over FN FAL guns after the 1968 thing and the whole G series thing in the early 70s. Most would be on Type 3 receivers, but there were some Type 2 and Type 1s coming in early. But even the early Type 3s, they were interesting. They had a T48 style flash hider, and it was known for opening up like a banana. So they actually did a bit of a recall, giving you the later style combat device. It's a cool story, check it out. And they called their semi-automatic version in America the LAR. And in 1977, they switched from Type 3 forged receivers to Type 3 cast. And we've talked a little bit about that already, but the FN guns brought over in the 80s were on cast receivers. They also had a few other minor cost-saving things. For example, they quit painting certain areas, and they quit marking the gas regulator and the gas valve. Just small ways of speeding up production, that you would expect. Because by the 1980s, FN was really not fulfilling military contracts anymore. But the MBEL guns that Springfield started bringing over in 85 were not only cheaper than the FN guns. The FN guns were really expensive, guys. They started off with the standard light barrel version, then they would go to a heavy barrel, and they would do a Paratrooper. Not many of them, around 1,300, 1,400, but they were spendy. They're like 1,500, 1,800 and 1980s bucks. Whereas the Springfields were 1,000 or less. And they too would do pretty much all the variations, and they would still be on a Type 3 receiver, but it would still be forged. MBEL in Brazil never went over to casting. They would have kind of a higher gloss paint finish. Typically, you just have the standard SAR 48, but there would be some variations. But Springfield would bring over receivers too, and that's where this gun comes from. They would have some Israeli heavy barrel kits, and they would build them up at Springfield using M-Bell receivers. So that's why it's a little odd to type 3 receiver on an Israeli gun. But it is technically a pre-ban. So much like with our SBL Arms Corps gun, these are built from used parts on a new semi-automatic receiver. And again, since it was sold in the 80s, no US parts, just US assembly. I think that's pretty good. I mean, would I like it on an Israeli receiver? Sure, but there aren't many SBL heavy barrels. And I've had this gun for a long time, found it local. Actually quite an affordable price back then. And whereas the light barrel Israeli kits are pretty hard to find in America, the heavy barrel kits, that's not so hard. You can find those even today, and especially for years, they were pretty affordable even with the original barrels, and you could build them up on any metric receiver and make a really good gun. And I do like LMG types based on assault rifles, based on battle rifles. I know in military parlance they weren't that practical, but for me, they were pretty cool. Now, Springfield would continue to import M-Bell guns and receivers post 1989. They would rename them SAR 4800 and sell them through roughly 1996. They would not only do the 308 version, they would do a run of 223 guns. And those are pretty cool. I had one years ago, sold it to a friend when I was traveling to Russia to live. Would love to buy it back one day. But until then, oh well. They took AR-15 mags for that matter. They weren't exactly military, but they were cool. So the SAR 48s and SAR 4800s definitely made a name for themselves in the market, along with the M-Bell receivers. And other companies would start bringing over M-Bell receivers too. Century Arms did their L1A1s, as we talked about, and Enterprise did some on M-Bell receivers for a few years. And really, when I was getting into the game, they were considered one of the 2 best receivers to build on, with DSA kind of being the other. And M-Bell receivers, you had some that had the gear logo, some that didn't. These were among the best semi-autos, and since they were metric, they were pretty universal. A lot of people would cut them and modify them for, say, inch pattern or other things. It's even worth pointing out for a gun like this, because the Israeli guns were an early pattern, they actually have slightly different threading for the barrel end of the receiver than later pattern. So you have to either modify the barrel or the receiver, but it's no big deal, especially for someone like Springfield. This gun's been 100% reliable over the years. But I wanted to give credit to M-Bell, even though this is my only M-Bell receiver gun. I don't know, I just never quite fell into the M-Bell thing. That's because I had another preference for a different South American FAL maker. And for anyone who's been around the channel, you know what's coming next. Yep, one nation that absolutely not only issued the FAL, but manufactured it was Argentina. For that matter, Brazil made a heavy barrel, although I don't know how many they actually issued. And of course, Belgian guns were in service themselves. Retroactively, they called the polymer stocked version the 50.41 and the wood stocked version the 50.42. And this is much closer to the FN pattern, including the very exposed barrel instead of having those metal heat shields and this rounded handguard. This is the early style kind of slab side wood carry handle. There was a light barrel version of this handle too. Has the paint over phosphate finish, standard charging handle instead of the special one. Of course, this would have in the military had a 3-way selector, but doesn't here. It actually has a standard rear sight as well, and the wood stock version has a flip up butt plate, but the polymer just has a rubber. And these were issued with 30 round mags, although of course 20s would fit as well. And you go out here and you have a different barrel. Now this is the later style flash hider, and you notice it's got a lot of gobbledygook going on back here because the bipod, well, it attaches a bit differently. Yeah, this is heavy duty rebar girder, and then it has two pieces that clip on to keep it not exactly quick detach, but it can easily be installed in the field if needs be. Just don't drop your pieces. So let me throw them on and I'll be right back. It does go on pretty easy. You have the bipod, you have the limiter, and you have this spring clip that goes on just to hold it from flopping back. It's well done. It really is. And this is sturdy. The only issue is when you try to set it like this, it does tend to monopod just a bit on a 30 round mag. And in Argentina, whereas the light barrel was called the FAL regardless, they actually called this the FAP. Yep, the FAP. It works. And they did field these on the squad level. And yes, they did use them in the Falklands War. Very, very similar to the Belgian, but there's a little difference here and there. But yeah, those are the only nations that really did it. These are both considered metric. And the flash hider does have kind of one neat feature too. While it definitely cannot take a bayonet, neither can the Israeli, it is actually internally threaded for a standard blank fire device. I don't know, I just kind of find it interesting. That's what those little serrations are for on the end. They detent in there. Not sure how often that was actually used, but yeah, it could support it. So it's still technically a combo device, even if it can't launch grenades or mount a bayonet. But yeah, this is one of the prides in my FAL collection for sure, because there just aren't many of these in the US of A. Still has the tall sights. But you know, I mentioned the Falklands. We've looked at two metric FALOs. What's the Commonwealth up to? This is not meant to be a complete, comprehensive video. None of these long ones can be, so forgive me for some things left out or left vague, for whatever that's worth. And for our third and final FALO variant, we have the L2A1. Now, as I'm sure you know, Britain did not have a heavy barrel FAL. Instead, they had the L4A1, which was a 7.62 NATO Bren. Really cool gun, but yeah. Canada, on the other hand, developed the initial C2 not long after the C1. And that would give way to the C2A1 not too long after. But they would work with Lithgow in Australia, setting up production for the L2A1, really the only major version produced there. And they would first get the L1A1 up and running in Australia, quite logically, in 1958, 1959. And then in the early 60s, they would do the heavy barrel version at a much slower rate of production. In fact, they built fewer than 10,000 over a decade run, with a few more made in the 70s and 80s. And it's pretty much what you'd expect. We have a heavy barrel, completely exposed. This does have the earlier style 5-slot flash hider. It also has the gas block with removable ears. At least some versions did. Kind of interesting. Very exposed for cooling. Unlike other heavy barrels, the handle doesn't face forward, but it is offset more forward and is of a thicker design to help again with the balance. The pistol grip, the stock, pretty well the same, but the rear sight is quite unique. instead of being on the lower frame, it's on the dust cover. This was on the original C2, but for the C2A1 they went to a larger adjustable disc. And of course there was a 30 round inch pattern magazine, but those are pretty uncommon. What you find more frequently are the L4A1 mags, very similar, but they have more of a curve to them. They also have a somewhat lighter spring because they're meant to be, well, Brin mags from the top. But the actual L2, and for that matter C2 mags, are straight. No surprises when we flip it over. Australian oiled wood furniture. Of course, now we have a three-way selector instead of two. As I mentioned earlier, the Canadian C1A1D also had this. Folding handle. Manual hold open, not automatic. And then of course, our quite unique handguard / bipod combo. And in some ways this is the most useful and maybe lightest of the bipods because it is combining units. Is it a great handguard? No. But the bipod does sit back further, which gives a little bit better elevation, and you can squeeze it and then just pull it down. So essentially you can deploy it single-handed. And you can detach it. There's a pin that runs here, and then there's a cotter pin behind it that retains it if you want to pop it out. Just remember not to grab the barrel. I can't even imagine how toasty that would get. But it's a very unique look. It still has the sand cut bolt carrier. Again, adjustable rear sight. Again, on the L2A1, the C2A1 would go to a large disc. Notice it doesn't monopod on the mag quite as bad as the other ones. So it's a unique pattern, although the rear, aside from not having a rear sight on the lower, is pretty well standard. And they never did put the black furniture on these. That was a British thing. These were used by Australia and also New Zealand, and a handful of others were given to friendly nations because Lithgow, unlike say Steyr, did sell and did export guns, and they built roughly 250,000 between 1959 and the very early 80s. And these rather famously saw combat in Vietnam. While some would be used as is, some would be cut down and turned into what was affectionately known as a bitch rifle. And they would even be fitted with underbarrel XM48 grenade launchers. And the benefit of this, obviously, you don't have a quick change barrel, so it is going to overheat, it is going to expend ammo, but you are going to get a little bit more out of it than a standard rifle, and having a bipod and a somewhat more user-friendly rear sight, a little more stable, means you're going to get a little bit better accuracy, maybe a little bit better range, just a little bit better. Of course, this does come at the cost of weight, although I'm going to say the L2A1 is the lightest of the FALOs that I have here, the FALOs. I could be wrong on that. It could just be perception. It could just be that the bipod's further back and not throwing things off. But to me, it feels just a little bit lighter. Certainly heavier than the L1A1 and the SLR. But yeah, close in there. I had an option when I got this years ago to either get an L2A1 or a Canadian C2. I went with the L2A1 because of the combat record and the fact that this was pretty much all Aussie, except for the receiver, which was made to look Aussie, including the serial number. So that was pretty cool. I just felt like it was a little more authentic, even down to the phosphate finish that Australian guns usually had, and the oiled finish to the wood. There are different types of wood furniture you'll find on Australian guns over the years. I mean, you know, they made them for 2 decades, so there will be changes, as I'm sure you could expect. So yeah, not as much going on with the FALO as the standard 50-00 rifle. I don't want to say it was a failed experiment, but it kind of was a failed experiment. It really wasn't a great light machine gun. It worked okay as a support weapon in limited bursts. The 30-round mags, be it the metric or even the inch, weren't as reliable as the 20s, and it was heavier, but you did get a little bit more out of it. I understand why they tried it. It just didn't quite work out. The RPK, while it had limitations too, worked a little better because it was firing a true intermediate cartridge. Calling 7.62 NATO intermediate is stretching a point a bit. Perhaps if these were still on the original 280 round, they would have been more useful, but maybe not. You know, who's to say? Hindsight. And with that, we've looked at the rifles, the long guns. As we enter the home stretch, we'll talk about the shorter variants in military service. More cat time. So what if you want an Australian gun or an L2A1? Well, you're pretty much stuck with kit builds. But you can do one on an Aussie receiver. You see, as early as 1983, 84, a company, Onyx, also a company, Eden, started bringing over semi-automatic receivers from Lithgow, Australia. Now, yeah, these were just receivers, so if you see an Eden or Onyx marked gun, the receiver is authentic, but it was built up here in the USA. And so you can find some L2A1s that were kits that were built on these receivers, and that's a great option. Or even an Aussie L1A1 kit. True authentic inch receivers built in a very high quality factory. But if you really want a 100% Australian built gun, your options are pretty limited. Beginning in 1987, and really just running through 1988, even before the assault weapons ban this was over, Joe Poirier brought over 158 Australian L1A1As. These were semi-automatic guns built by Lithgow, and they're slightly different from military guns in the stock finish and all that stuff. Little differences because they were using up leftover parts as they were switching over to the F88 and later the F90 bullpups. So they're pretty much just using their tooling to make a few bucks. Now Poirier also brought over some just receivers. So you can find some Poirier's receivers, and people would use those to build L2A1s. Here's the thing about the Poiriers. They go for very, very much money, and all the semi-autos were L1A1s, so light barrel. Now yes, there are some Poirier L2A1s out there. Those were built either by stripping one of the rifles or just by the receiver brought over by Poirier just as a virgin receiver. There were even some Lithgow 80% brought over, but they required a lot of finishing. And finally, yes, Poirier did bring over a few L2A1s, but these were machine guns, and if memory serves, they would have been post-sample. Maybe they squeezed in right before the 86 ban. I don't think so, though. But there were a handful of Poirier L2s as actual complete guns, but they were select fire. So those are kind of your options there. Otherwise, some years back, good old DS Arms did a run of inch pattern receivers with correct lightning cuts, and they even gave them 80 prefix serials, which are Australian. So while you can use these receivers to do a British build, they were really intended for Australian L1 or L2 builds, and that's why I have this one done here. I've had chances to do Poiriers, but the receiver, and that would have been neat to do this on, but money, guys. The kit, the L2 kit, is expensive enough, so got to cut it off somewhere. And it's kind of where the Canadian guns come from too. I would love to have a Canadian C1A1, and if you look at some of our early videos, you'll see that I had one, sort of. The problem is Canada, unlike Australia and Britain, never surplus their guns and sold them here. So the parts that we have just kind of came over, and they were pretty restrictive. So even that build, for one, it was on a DSA receiver, which you'd expect, and it also had to be built with a Lithgow barrel, although things like the dust cover, the furniture, even the lower, in fact it was a C1A1D lower, were Canadian. So the Canadian builds kind of have to be pieced together. Therefore, if you see someone with a complete C1A1 build, give them a round of applause, because it was probably very difficult to get all the right parts. Maybe one day I'll find one. Again, I sold mine. It was part of the guns I sold to kind of pay for moving or something else. Kind of regret it, kind of don't. If it had been a perfect build, I would have regretted it more, but since it was a mix of Aussie and Canadian parts, yeah, and that's kind of my problem with FALs, is I really wanted to be as good as I can do. And unfortunately that C1A1 wasn't, but then again, very, very few are. Oh well, c'est la vie. I'm happy to have my L2A1 though. But what do you think? Really are saving the best, or at least most popular, for last. The FAL Paratrooper, or just the FAL Para. Now mine is an Argentine gun, because that's just kind of my bag, guys. I love my Argentines. I've owned FNs before, and they're great, but for one, they tend to have a higher resale value, especially back when I had mine. And as I mentioned a couple times earlier, for a while these Argentine guns, every bit as good quality, factory, military-made guns, in some ways better, and less money, and frankly rare, more unique. But we'll get to that. Here's my standard 50-00 21-inch with the bipod installed. You can pull it off. And here we have the Para. Now when the FAL launched, we had the regular version, and it wouldn't be very long enough before the heavy barrel. It was almost developed concurrently. But for the Paratrooper, well, we'd have to wait a few years. And that was a mechanical issue. So you need a folding stock. That's easily done on guns like, say, the AK. But not on a gun like the FAL. As we've talked about, the so-called rat's tail on the bolt carrier comes back into the stock, and we have a very skinny but very powerful spring back here. Anyone who's ever removed an FAL buttstock, you know what I'm talking about. So, are we going to be like the AR-15 and just give up? Are we a quitter? No. FN's not a quitter. We want to have a folding stock, because we have paratroopers, and we have mechanized infantry that, still need something to get in and out of vehicles. This is the 60s now, early to mid 60s when we're talking. We need something more compact. What do? How do we get this stock? Where did that spring go? Is it a fourth dimension? Not quite. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of this video. That's right, the FN49. The Saffin's bolt doesn't have a spring in the stock. It actually is entirely mounted in the top cover. Now it has a little more room to play with, but then again it also has larger cartridges. FN applied that to the FAL. All of your recoil spring is right up here in this short distance. And it's kind of neat. This has one large spring outside and then two small springs joined together with a guide rod in the mid under it. And if you open up an FN49, it's very similar. It's actually crazy just how similar that system is. Of course, it's a little different in the details because of the top cover being very, very different, but the springs themselves are almost interchangeable. So they had to do that. They also had to get the spring technology. You know, we don't think about it today, but tempering springs, getting them to work properly and hold their shape and tension, there's a lot of technology behind that. I think partially too it's just the need. So they did that, and that required a whole new bolt carrier, new recoil system, totally new top cover. It also required a new receiver, or at least a new cutout for the nose of the bolt carrier dust cover to fit into. And then of course that required new parts for the folding stock. And this stock is so good that a lot of modern stocks today, and certainly a lot you saw in the 80s, are directly copied and inspired by it. To open it, it's pretty straightforward. You just pull it. Sorry, hard to do one-handed, while pressing this button in at the bottom, this little locking latch. And then it'll spring into place. Now to fold it again, you press the latch and pull down. So it's kind of like a Galil stock, but with one extra locking aspect. And again, that's because they were expecting paratroopers to use this. The Galil folding stock, for example, that's on all the Galils. But this is really meant for paras. And that explains the variations we see here with this gun. But this is actually the third out of 4 major iterations of the Paratrooper that FN offered. So we've talked about how the 50-41 and 50-42 were the heavy barrels. The first folding stock model was the 50-61. And that was basically taking your standard rifle, but giving it the folding stock treatment. So it had the 21-inch barrel, and everything else was standard. That was okay for infantry, and you actually see a lot of nations using them. In fact, for military users, the 50-61 was probably the most popular folding stock model. Full-length barrel, all that good stuff. But you saved nearly a foot getting in and out of things. Ironically, this mechanism did make it heavier. And this charging is a little stiffer because you've got a much shorter spring throw and you're going up against a much stouter spring. It's stiffer, but also kind of oddly smoother. Okay, so the next step was the 50.62. This is the first version that FN really did for paratroopers. They took the barrel down from 21 inches to 18 inches. Good step, losing 3 inches of barrel. 18 inches is still a great length for 7.62 NATO 308. And they would send a test batch to Belgian paratroopers. And they liked the gun. They liked this folding stock. This is a durable metal with some composite on top. It was a sturdy stock. These really put up with some abuse. The recoil system, which could have been problematic, actually worked fine. Thanks FN49. But they found that the gun was just a hair too long. Just a little bit. We need to chop that barrel down. And that's where we get the 50.63 here. This barrel is about 17.3, 17.4 inches. It's kind of a weird number. But they lobbed it down just enough to go through the door safely of the cargo planes that paratroopers were using, the flying boxcar, while not sacrificing length. So you notice the barrel is much shorter, but it still uses the same full-length gas system, same short-stroke gas piston, same gas regulator. Heck, you can even put your bipod on here. Notice the barrel has the cut for the bipod, and the handguards do. Now this is the newer pattern of handguard. It's not really a shiny black. It's more of a matte, deep gray, even slightly green hue. But these are very, very durable. So we did that. While we're at it, we made a few other changes. I should point out, I did put the aluminum alloy magazine in. As I said, everyone calls these Paratrooper mags, including me. And I'm sure Paratroopers would use them. But some have told me they actually got started with the West German G1s. Either way, these are a lot lighter than a standard mag. They're great for being lightweight. Just thought I'd mention that. Not that you can feel it on camera. Typically, the 5063s were select fire, but of course this is a civilian legal, semi-auto only. As far as I know, these always had the horizontal takedown. Probably the vertical wouldn't work so well. In fact, they have the somewhat flat button at that, so it wouldn't snag. And that's kind of the name of the game here, snag free. For one, we have the folding handle from the L1A1, which is really just an update suggested by the Allied Rifle Commission anyway. And of course the receiver has to be properly machined to let that fold. Not only does it give you something that won't snag, it actually gives the Paratrooper a snugger, more defined grip than the standard one, so it's a win-win. Now, like I said, this is an FMAP gun, an Argentine. It does not have a carry handle, but it uses the same notch up here. They just put a little donut, little spacer. Most of your FN guns actually don't have a cut on the receiver here at all for a carry handle. So that I'd point that out. Small difference between Argentine and Belgian guns, at least by the most part. And last but not least, we have a new pattern of rear sight. Whereas the 61 used this standard rear sight, and of course with the Argentine, this is a tall rear sight at that. So as you can imagine, this was not ideal for paratroopers. This could easily get knocked, bent, or even hang the soldier up. So here we get a new rear sight that has really cool protective ears, nice and slim, and it's a fixed peep. It doesn't have a flip. It's just a single peep set at 250 meters, although you can adjust it for windage by the screws. But it's not elevation adjustable, although you can modify the front side. I think it was just, meant to be simple and dependable, durable, robust over adjustable. Plus with the shorter barrel, they probably figured 250, 300 meters, that's about as far as you're going to be shooting with this in practical terms. This is also sometimes referred to as the Holland style rear sight, because if it's used on some of their FALs. And of course the rear swivel is here at the front part of the stock. Interestingly, it doesn't have much swivel to it. It can shift a few degrees, but has stops. The front here is the same on a barrel band as any other. Now, if I wanted to be really correct, I could put a standard Argentine sling on this. Like I said, I could even put my bipod. But I wanted to make this my lightweight FAL. So, lightweight mag. This is one of the later style FN slings. This is an FN/L1A1 sling. It's just of the nylon style, so it's the lightest sling I've got. No bipod. And this actually is a light little gun. Although again, this stock does add a bit of weight. It does also have the compartment in the pistol grip to store a cleaning kit. So this was the version that went to paratroopers, and not just within Belgium, but a few other nations. Obviously Argentina included, where it was known as the Type 3. This was the Type 1, and the Type 2 was the FAP, the heavy barrel. But there would also be one more major production variant of the Para. And honestly, it's one I don't quite get. The 50 50.64. It's the exact same as the 5061 21-inch barrel and all, except instead of a steel lower, it has an aluminum alloy lower, which does save on weight, but since you're using the 21-inch barrel, it's kind of a wash. I've always thought it was unusual they didn't do a 50.63, yet with the aluminum alloy lower. They did produce the 64, but it seems to have been more of an experiment than anything else. Most customers, like I said, bought the 61 or the 63. You don't see many of the 5062s. Just, thought I'd mention that. And FN would make these, of course, in much smaller numbers than the full size, because it's a very specialist gun, and it was a more expensive gun. It was a little more fidgety to take apart, and of course, it didn't use the same recoil mechanism and bolt carrier as a standard gun, so you didn't have interoperability of parts. So, yeah. But, in other ways, it was very standard. In fact, you could even launch rifle grenades. Had the same combo device. Note that this does have the short sights. Here. And, of course, it can also accept a bayonet. Although, just barely. The bayonet comes right up to where the sling ring is. It's on there. There's no doubt about it. I'm sure that's a lot of consideration. And I can see where a paratrooper might want to carry a lightweight bayonet like this. Limited ammo. Nice to have a backup sticker. This is actually a different bayonet than we looked at earlier. I've got a few of these because you used to be able to pick these up for $5, $10. And there are some minor variations in them. Yeah. So this is a fully capable gun. It even has the internal threads for a blank fire device. And with that, we come down to the last FN FAL. And this is one of the kind of most mysterious and in some ways unofficial guns. I don't know that it has a FN factory designator, 50 point yada yada. But FN did make some, and other nations made them and used them. You see them in Africa. You see that Imbel did some, at least for the US market. And of course, here Argentina. The so-called Congo model, or as Springfield called it, the Bush carbine. This is a combination of a few features. And this one here is in Argentinian Type 4 configuration, which means it has the short sights. And in the rear, it has the later style 2-position peep sight. You have a 150 meter peep and a 250 meter peep. This is a paratype sight, although this version is still more common. It makes sense. It's still well protected and almost as durable. And you do get kind of a short range and a medium range peep. But standard fixed stock. But we have the barrel from a 50.62. This is an 18-inch barrel, which frankly, to my mind, is kind of an ideal length. Also a little odd, this one does not have the cut for the bipod, which is why the swivel is further back. And you'll note that the handguards are not handguard cut either, and they have the somewhat earlier style huge drain holes underneath, or vent holes, whatever you like to call them. Otherwise, it's pretty well standard. Fixed charging handle, standard carry handle that does rotate, Type 3 receiver, standard controls otherwise, and of course a military gun to be select fire. This is semi-auto. I really wish I could tell you more about the Congo or the Bush rifle, Bush carbine, But this just seems to be one of those things that was done almost informally at different factories because it just makes sense. It's essentially standard gun, but with a shorter barrel. And 3 inches matters. It makes it look more balanced, frankly. Feel more balanced. Saves a little bit of weight out front. And you're perfectly getting good velocity and range out of your cartridge. Anyway, it kind of matches up well with this Type 4 rear sight. Again, it's on a Type 3 receiver, which is really the last style that FN made. Well, kind of. Type 1, full lightning cuts. Type 2 had the reinforced section in the rear. Type 3, essentially the same receiver, just no lightning cuts, which was introduced in 1973. And in the beginning, this was a forged receiver. But in 1977, FN Herstal, Belgium, retained the Type 3, but went from forging to investment casting. And from that point onwards, the receivers that FN made were cast, including the majority of the guns that came over to America as semi-autos. So you might want to consider this a Type 4 receiver. However, both Imbel of Brazil and FMAP of Argentina continued forging their receivers even as Type 3s. That's one reason, even though I have nothing against the cast receivers that FN did, they're perfectly good. When the Imbels and FMAP guns are cheaper than Belgians, I figured, well, they're cheaper. And Belgians on a mission, the cast receiver is just not as good for as many rounds. They said, yeah, 40,000 rounds for a cast receiver, 60, maybe 70, maybe 80,000 rounds with a forged receiver, especially a Type 2 over a Type 1, or I should say, then over a Type 3. In a lot of ways, the forged Type 3 is the strongest of them all. So by FN's own literature, yeah. But then again, if you can afford to put 40,000 rounds through a single FAL, and that's not to say it would fail at 40,001 rounds, that just means they basically guarantee it to at least 40,000 rounds. And keep in mind, some of those that were anticipated to be automatic fire, something that us civilians really wouldn't have to worry about. Some other receiver subvariants, of course, would be the British simplified version, the Australian version, and the Canadian C1 version actually had a little thumbprint on the side for use with chargers. And then South Africa, their R1, had an ever so slightly different version of a lightning cut as well. And then, of course, the Israeli SBL receivers, well, they're their own thing too, but that's for the other section of the video. Just thought I'd mention that. And while later FAL barrels could be chrome lined, the early ones weren't. And like I said, Steyr would cold hammer forge their barrels, but they would never do a full chrome lined bore, just a chrome lined chamber, and only for the last 20, 30,000 they ever did. In the end, it's okay. Wasn't really needed. But the carbines are neat. Now you'll notice FN never did a shorter gas system. All their FALs use the same handguard length and same gas piston length. Of course, DS Arms has done true carbines, and we did a video on one of those back in the summer, about 6 months ago. And most of the guns with threads are left-hand, 13mm, although guns like the L1A1 are right-hand threaded. But they also have a keyed muzzle device too. And for the most part, all your metric guns take your same metric mags, and your inch guns are even more flexible because they take inch and metric mags. And by and large, these were designed to be parts, interchangeable parts, swappable, because it was meant to be a standard rifle for all of NATO. Each country who ordered one could customize it a bit, furniture, controls, but sub-assemblies and even assemblies were meant to interchange. Like if you took a lower off one, put it on another, it should work with little to no fitting. Which is honestly one of the FAL's charms. The fact that you can just pick one up and you don't need a welder, you don't need to worry about rivets. Basically everything is screwed on and screwed down in here, including the barrel. You can literally time a barrel in your garage, and if you just said headspace, well, you know, you've got your locking shoulder here. In a lot of ways, it's a very user serviceable gun, and it was meant to be repaired and refurbished and kept in action for a very, very long time. That's why a lot of them you see are rebuilt and are a hodgepodge of parts, because they could be. And it's also why the FAL became the right arm of the free world and remained in military service in most places for literally decades, a few places half a century, and even a few are still knocking about today, second line or training. But you know, aside from not being able to mount modern optics and all that good stuff, it's still a dependable gun and a very much modern and effective caliber, and it uses perfectly fine box mags. And so those are my FN FALs. And it's time to talk about the Argentine guns, which is a good jumping off point to talk about FN semi-automatic 50.61s and 63s and all that good stuff. But let's head to the table for that. These Argentine guns from DG FM or FMAP, Rosario at any rate, have really become a special interest to me. And I really got into them because at the time they were the most affordable pre-bands, often even cheaper than the MBELs, and I just thought of very interesting quality, and far fewer came in. Now they're on, of course, a forged, Type 3 receiver, not cast. And whereas the MBELs had a very glossy finish to the furniture, the Argentinian guns have more of a matte type, which I personally like more and kind of reminds me more of military guns, for whatever that's worth. And they have the paint finish that's semi-gloss. And we have a few different importers to talk about. One of the first was National Arms Corp. They brought over around 250 or so, seemingly in the early to mid-80s. Now the Argentine semi-automatic gun, known in South America as the FSL, and translated as the light semi-automatic rifle LSR, which is why these guns have both names, was introduced in 1982, post-Falklands War. It was nominally meant for the police and police forces, but also export because money, and Argentina needed to bring in cash, and that was a good way. They had the production line. So we started to see these get imported. So National Arms was the first, and they brought over a few. You can tell them apart from the others because they have the low sights. This is not a National Arms, but just to show you here on this Congo. And they would have the lower rear sight in the rear. So that's one easy way to tell the National Arms, and they'll have fully serialized parts. Really good, really cool guns. The next FMAP guns would come in thanks to Pedro Bello, who actually got his start with FAL importation back around 1976, 1977, working with FN Belgium. He brought over 10 Type 2 guns with the kind of T-48 style muzzle device, I believe. But these are quite rare today, as you might imagine. But it kind of gave him a taste for it, and with his connections in South America, he brought over roughly 200 and they were pretty well, from what I know, they were just the standard 50.00 style. He might have brought over a few prototypes of other types, but again, relatively small batch numbers, same factory. But of course, the major importer, well, you see here today. Armscor brought over the majority in the 1980s, if it can be said to be that, because they still imported under 1,000. The earlier guns will have a Spring, Maryland import mark, and the later ones will have Baltimore, for whatever that's worth. I've seen different serial number ranges there, hard to say. And it seems like the serials did start over with each importer. Like this one here has got a serial number 36. And you see the pre-banned guns run up to roughly serial number 900. I'm not sure if they crossed over into 1,000 or not, but fewer than 1,000. So all told, including all three importers, you're looking at 1,500 or less. That's a small number, especially considering that FN sent over nearly 1,400 of just the paratroopers alone. Now, FN had its own importers. You had the Southern guns, you had the Browning guns you've talked about, you had the Steyr guns. You even had another batch that came in with the auto sear cutout that again had to be grandfathered in the 1970s. Like I said, the FN guns tend to get a little more leeway than other guns. It could just be that even the ATF/IRS recognizes that a full auto 308 battle rifle is not exactly useful. But then again, when does that ever stop them? Now, there was one change made to these pre-bans from their military, besides, of course, being with the semi-auto selector only, and that was the muzzle device. The short barrel here has the standard device, notch for a bayonet, flash hider slots, 22 mil grenade ring back here, knurled front end with the threads for a blank fire device that we've already looked at. But the standard model brought in had a slightly different muzzle device. It might look the same at first. It does still have the cutout for the bayonet, but you notice there's no cutout for the ring at all. And it has a smooth face, and there's no internal threads. Why was this done? Now, some say it's because the FSL started off as a police gun, so they didn't want the ability to launch grenades, and I guess that also meant not having a screw-in blank fire device. That could be. I will point out, though, one of the things the 1968 Gun Control Act did prohibit was the importation of grenade launchers, and this would be interpreted by different importers in different foreign factories in different ways. Some guns would retain rings and stuff like this, others would not. So it could just be playing it safe. They just took the ring off and didn't thread them internally while they were at it, just to make sure they could get imported. It could also be that it was more of an Argentinian export thing, where they did not want to export something with a grenade launcher. Again, I'm not sure. I don't know that anyone is 100% sure, but this is the correct muzzle device with a few points of neutering for a pre-bang gun. But of course, you can always unscrew them and put on a standard device. They're standard 13mm left-hand threads. Just thought I would share that. On to my heavy barrel, so we can talk about its variants. Now, FN Herstal did send over some heavy barrels of their own, and I've owned two of them, both a 50.42 and a 50.41. But believe it or not, they're a lot more common than the FMAP heavy barrel. Very few of these came in. I don't know exactly how few, but this, for example, is serial number 11. it really does not seem like many came over. And as far as I know, they were all with the plastic stock and pistol grip, but the wood handle and wood grip forearm. I really do like this type of bipod. Very sturdy. It also has more pivot. And what's interesting, we were just talking about the muzzle device. This one has the internal threading like we looked at, but of course it doesn't have the ability to launch a rifle grenade. So that kind of tells me that was the main consideration there. And yeah, I wish I had more information. We do know that these definitely came in. There's an old Arms Corps brochure showing these. I don't know if anyone else imported them, Bello or National. I don't think so, but I very much could be wrong. Keep in mind too, FALs are very easily rebuilt. It's easy to strip one of its receiver and build other things on it, which is something it really has over, say, a G3. Not that you can't rebarrel a G3, but you get what I'm saying. Either way, it's one of the prides in my collection. That said, I can understand why a semi-automatic gun that's just heavier and really no more accurate was not a great seller for FN or FM. Either way, it does complete my set. That is alongside the Paratrooper. Again, I don't know how many of these came in from Argentina, but numbers are very small. You certainly see more of the FN 5063s than you do the FMAPs. Now this one has an odd serial, but that's because it's actually a prototype gun. This came out of the collection of the former owner of Arms Corps, as did this gun. And this one, actually, I did a bit of a customization on, not myself, but I had him do it. I wanted a Congo, but most of your Congos have the tall sights, the handful you run across. I thought having the Type 4 low sights would be neat, so that's what I had done here. Because this was kind of the last pattern that Argentina did, and that gets us into a discussion about post-ban FM receiver guns. So, Arms Corps was the importer up until the 1989 ban. At that time, there were some guns essentially caught in customs or coming over. So there was a cutoff around serial number 900. Again, I wish I could give you an exact number, but I've not found one yet. If you have one, drop it in the comments. But we do see a return of FM, AP, FSL, LSR guns in 1993. And the way they got around the 89 ban, they split them apart. And this is actually where DSA gets into the FAL game. In that year, Dave sold about 1,000 barrel receivers, and then the other parts, the lower, the bolt carrier, even the muzzle device, were sold by a different company, A&D Global. So you bought one part and then another, and they were able to get around the import restrictions at the time. And then they would do another 3,000 guns this way in 1994. So roughly 4,000 post-ban guns. So 1,500 or less pre-ban, 4,000 or so post-ban, for around 5,500. Again, I'm completely estimating and guesstimating here, but it gives you some idea. Some just receivers show up too. And I have no idea how many virgin FMAP receivers are in the country. They're all Type 3 though. No Argentine Type 1s seem to have come in, at least that I'm aware of. Now, I will say that Arms Corps did take some Type 3s and machine them to look like Type 1s in the USA, in Maryland. So that's cool. In fact, they did several builds with their T48 markings on those. But yeah, getting back to the post-band. For one thing, they'll have a serial over 1,000, which again makes this one a bit of an outlier, but it, if you notice, doesn't have the import marks either, because it was out of a different batch. But they will also have markings on the inner of the mag well. In this flange, you'll find SAC for Southern Ammunition Corp and SAC LATA. Those were all post-ban. Little nice tasteful mark, no harm, no foul in here. Now typically these guns will not be serial matching because people will just buy a barreled action. They would buy a kit from Global and then they'd put them together. They wouldn't be matching, but they'd work fine. But this was the era of the dawn of the internet. People started doing message boards, forums, saying, I've got serial number blah blah blah, what do you have? So some of these were put back to rights as they should have been sold in 1989. They weren't intentionally mixed up on the numbers. It just kind of was a side effect of that whole thing, if you see what I'm saying. So they were good guns. I mean, they were still built with the pre-ban style. They just had to be broken apart here to get around import restrictions. And these honestly kind of confused things for a while because they looked the same as a pre-ban gun except for the numbers. And maybe are one of the reasons that Argentine guns were kept at a lower price point than FNs and even MBELs. Maybe not, maybe so. But there is one more batch worth talking about, and a batch that actually hung on into the 21st century. Remember how I said this was a Type 4? Well, no surprise, this was a Type 1. This was considered a Type 2 in Argentina, and the Paratrooper was considered a Type 3. Type 4 was the late style production, not only with the low sights, but they put the 2-position sight on a fixed stock gun. Now most Type 4s would have a 21-inch barrel, but yeah, this one has an 18, but it has the earlier style handguards. Yeah, this is again kind of my own gun from the collection, but that was the last major production run. Now there was a Type 5 planned for as an updated, modernized FAL for Argentine service, and they did make some, and they did update others, but it didn't really take off as far as I think they'd hoped it had. So 1 through 5, with 5 being of limited production. Anyway, to the Type 4 itself, Sarco had some of these kits, essentially virgin semi-auto only kits, for quite a long time. I think they had them up to like 2013, 2014 even. And they had original barrels, they had semi-auto lowers. They were really in great shape. You know, some storage wear, of course, but nothing horrible. And so that was one of the last good ways to get an original barreled South American kit. Even after the MBEL kits had dried up, you could still get those Sarco Argentine kits, Type 4 style, which was a good way to get a Paratrooper rear sight. Or at least the 2-position style. So the Argentine guns really hung on for quite a while, but after the DSA/Global Saclata marked guns, that was pretty much it. They didn't hang on. Of course, really FAL importation would end with the 20th century, if we're being honest. It wouldn't last. Then of course kit builds would take over, and of course you would get the various US receivers, but I don't know. I just find these very interesting, and again, very small numbers all in all. What do you think though? What's your favorite configuration? If only I had a barn door to lean these up against. And there we have it. If you think this took me all night to do, it was more than all night. This is about day number 3, and I've pretty much worked through. Again, I'm probably going to be taking a break for the holidays, resting up, getting some new guns. I'm not sure what we're going to do because I'm in the middle of building the shooting range and cabin, so that's kind of taking up my time and resources. And far from getting new guns, unless they're just T&Es or friends' loaner guns, I don't know that I'll be buying a lot for the first half of 2024. The good news is there's not a whole lot to buy. But what I can say is I am not planning on selling any of my FALs. In fact, I still would like to pick up an R1 build, kind of done to my standards, correct receiver, original parts. And there's a few others I'd love to do, like a T48 clone, but it's so hard to do those correctly, and I don't like half-assing my FALs. If I'm going to do them, I want to do them correct and right. And to me, that's fun. For you, it may not be. As we talked about already, I just have a special place in my heart for the Argentinian guns, Argentine. But I also find the Israelis interesting. And the British guns may just be my favorite because they are the most authentic. But what's your favorite? I mean, I'd like to have this as a discussion. Maybe even I'll do a live stream talking about this video, because I would be happy to answer questions. Let me know. So if you'd like to tune into live streams, that'd be fun. If not, Patreon. Like I said, I did this video because Patreons wanted it. I will do the AR-10, AR-15, but that'll be sometime next year now. These they take a lot of time and energy, which I'm happy to do, but still. But yeah, let me know. With that, this is Misha. Hope everyone's having a good holiday season. And catch you very soon next time.